What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh format guide, and in this guide we're going to be diving into the ins and outs of Vampire format, which is the format that takes place in February 2004, right after the February 2004 TCG Limited list dropped. So this format is, I think, not really too different from the previous format, Breaker format. There are some major changes in terms of like quality of life things. For instance, the Scientist of FDK is sort of cut down a bit, as Scientist is limited to one copy here. But I think besides that, the new cards that came out in Dark Crisis, which was the latest core booster set, didn't really affect the game too much, although there were some notable inclusions that did change things quite a bit. So I'm excited to dive in to this format and discuss it with y'all. But first, if you like this sort of content and are not subscribed already, then definitely hit that subscribe button. Subscribe to the channel, really helps out a lot. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers. It would be really nice to reach that by the end of the year. And also let me know down in the comments below what you think about Vampire format and whether you're excited for it or if it's not really your favorite thing. But I'm excited for it at least. So let's dive in to this new updated February 2004 limited list here. And, you'll notice that things haven't really changed too much. Most of the monsters here are already on the list, and some of the new changes aren't really that impactful. But let's just dive through the cards one card at a time and just discuss it for those of you who maybe haven't seen my previous format guides and are a bit confused about why certain things are on this list at all. So first up, we've got Cyberjar. Cyberjar is a pretty degenerate flip monster, destroys the field, gets 5 cards out of the deck, and this can be good in a strategy known as Empty Jar, which uses multiple jar effect monsters to sort of mill people's decks out. Next up, we've got Fiber Jar, which actually isn't really as good in the Empty Jar deck, although there are some versions of Empty Jar that can play it if they're on like a banish strategy and stuff. But Fiber Jar resets the decks. So basically, when it's flipped, both players shuffle the decks together and draw 5 cards, which can drag on the time of the game for quite some time and can feel somewhat degenerate if you just keep triggering this card. So that's why it's limited to one copy here. Next up, we've got all the pieces of Exodia here. This is mainly for like lore reasons because, people should only have access to one piece of Exodia at a time because this is like, some all-powerful old sorcerer who's been locked up and split into 5 pieces. So it would only make sense if there's only one copy per piece. Although, in the past, this has been good at multiples, so maybe there's actually some merit to keeping it like this, but I think the lore reason suffices. So we've got all those pieces there. We've also got Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, both of here on there for similar reasons. They can just search out pretty much any monster you'd want from the deck, which is just very strong. When you have multiples of these, it can lead to the games taking a little bit longer than they normally would because you could use Sangan to search out another Sangan, search out another Witch, to search out another Witch, and so on and so forth. And that style of gameplay isn't necessarily bad, like Critter format uses it, and it's very fun, but it can drag the game out quite a bit. We've also got Jinzo here, a very powerful tribute monster. Negates all your opponent's traps, which can allow you to go for big OTK pushes or just big damage pushes in general. So very hard for people to deal with on their opponent's turn. And that's why it's limited to one copy here. We've also got Sinister Serpent. This card is a great renewable resource. The effect on screen isn't quite right because we used the old DM era effect, which was basically if this card is in your graveyard during your standby phase, you can just add it back to hand. So you can use this for discard effects. You can just use this as a blocker that just keeps going back to your hand every turn. This card is very strong for multiple reasons. Next up is Yatagarasu, a very iconic card that will be a lot more trouble in the coming formats. But Yatagarasu is a spirit monster that, when it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, they don't get to draw their next turn. Now, with only 200 attack, this might not seem bad, but there are ways to deplete your opponent's hand and resources to the point where you can just summon out Yatagarasu and basically win the game on the spot because your opponent doesn't have any way to deal with it, and you just keep attacking in every turn. So Yata is a very powerful card and somewhat degenerate card if you can pull off the Yata lock. Next up, we've got Exiled Force, which is a great searchable piece of removal. Being able to use this effect with priority in this format is very good. And there are a lack of sort of non-spell removal options. There are some, but there aren't as many as there will be in the future, which does make this card a useful sort of flexible spot in your deck to just have access to and to potentially search out. Next up, we've got Injection Fairly. This card can get in a lot of damage because when it attacks, you can pay 2,000 life points, buff it up to 3,400, which is very, very strong. Next up, we've got Twin-Headed Behemoth, which is mainly here for just a rulings issue because if you have multiple Twin-Headed Behemoths, since its effect is once per duel, if they get shuffled back into the deck, with something like Fiber Jar, then you won't necessarily know which one has triggered its effect or not. And so it was a big ruling sort of, not dispute, but it was an issue at the time to rule. So that's why it's limited to one copy here. Next up, we got Breaker. This card is a good beater at 1900 or 1600. That also lets you destroy an opponent's spell trap, which is also extremely good. So that's why this card's at one copy here. Next up, we've got Tribe Infecting Virus. This card can just be used to nuke your opponent's board at the cost of your own cards, sure, but things like Sinister Serpent makes that cost a little bit less bad. And this card is just very, very strong at just being able to clear the way and then get in for some damage, because 1600 attack is not that bad on a monster here. Next up, we've got Magical Scientist. This card is insanely good, and it actually led to one of the best decks of the last format, Breaker, which was Scientist FTK. Basically, if you have Scientist and a card called Catapult Turtle on your field at the same time, and you've got 8,000 life points, you could actually burn out your opponent in one turn. So having this at 3 copies made that FTK a bit more consistent. The FTK, I think, is still somewhat consistent, but limiting this down to 1 makes you see it a lot less often in the opening hand, and so decreases the consistency of that combo quite a bit. Next up, we've got Vampire Lord. Vampire Lord is a new inclusion out of Dark Crisis, and it's easy to see why this card made it to the limited list. It's a tribute monster which has 2,000 attack, and it says if this card inflicts valid damage to your opponent, declare one card type monster, spell, or trap. Your opponent sends one card of that type from their deck to the graveyard. That's honestly not that bad. Probably beneficial for effect for your opponent in most cases. But the next part can make this card kind of annoying to deal with. Once per turn during your next standby phase, after this card in your possession was destroyed and sent to your graveyard by an opponent's card effect, spell summon this card. Now, this is a very, very annoying effect for a lot of decks to deal with, because a lot of decks do use, sort of destruction removal on their opponent's monsters, and this card can sort of dodge that. So it makes sense why this card would get limited and be a scary card. As we'll discuss later in the video, I think that with a more modern reevaluation of this format, people sort of moved away from using Vampire Lord, and so maybe it didn't really deserve this limit here, but it makes sense why it was on here at the time. And lastly, we've got kind of a perplexing monster on this list. I'm not quite sure why this is here, and that's Reflect Bounder. Now, Reflect Bounder is a 1700 attack point monster with it's level 4, which means you can just summon it out normally. And it says, before damage calculation, if this card is being attacked by an opponent's monster and was in attack position at the start of the damage step, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the attacking monster's attack. If you do, after damage calculation, destroy this card. Now, that's a decent effect. Like, it gets in burn. 1700 attack is a decent stat on a monster here. But honestly, like, I don't know, this card doesn't really even seem that good. Your opponent can just play around it. And even if they've got like a tiny monster that can hit into this thing, destroy that thing. And yeah, so it just seems kind of bad, especially given that, there aren't any chaos monsters in this format that comes in the coming formats. And so its light attribute doesn't really do anything here either. So it's just kind of a weird card on this list. I mean, I get maybe it's like a limit to burn, because burn did get some tools in Dark Crisis that makes it a little bit better in my opinion. But I don't really think that this limit was needed. But, let me know down in the comments below if there is a reason why this card deserves to be on this list here. Moving on to these spells, we've got Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, Raigeki, the Power 5 limited spells. Those don't really need much explanation. We've got the 3 hand rips, Comfy, Duo, and Forceful Sentry. We got Painful Choice, which is a very powerful combo enabler. It also thins out your deck a bit, and it's just a very versatile card in general. You get to basically send 5 cards from your deck to the graveyard. Your opponent picks one and gives it to you. So if there are 5 cards in your deck that will win you the game, you can just send those 5 and then win the game from that. So this card is extremely, extremely good, and it only gets better as time goes on. Next up, we got Snatch Steal, which is basically Change of Heart as an Eclipse spell. We got Harpy's Feather Duster and Heavy Storm here to limit the amount of mass back row hate. We've got Graceful Charity, another draw spell. Upstart Goblin, another draw spell, although much less powerful than Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity here, as you only draw 1 card, and your opponent does gain 1,000, which does matter at this time. So, maybe it doesn't deserve to be on the list, but I think seeing some of the decks that we'll see later in this guide, it probably does belong here. Next up, we got Premature Burial, which is just revival for a monster. It can be stopped in more ways than something like Reborn, but it's still very, very good. Next up, we've got Mage Power and United Withstand to prevent sort of like OTKs, as these cards can buff up your monsters to obscene amounts of attack. And next up, we've got Card Destruction, which is a tool for like Empty Jar, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a deck that tries to mill you out. And Card Destruction is a key tool in that deck. So limiting down to 1 copy is a very good thing here. Next up, we got Swords Revealing Light, which is a stall tool. I'm not really sure this necessarily needs to be at 1 copy anymore, but better safe than sorry. Next up, we've got Mirage of Nightmare, which is a very, very powerful draw card. Very, very insane. If you've never played with this card, it's really, really good. It draws you until you have 4 cards in hand, and if you have a way to remove it with something like a Mystical Space Typhoon, or even to shut it down with something like an Imperial Order, then you get to keep all those cards that you drew. So very, very strong and very, very versatile. And lastly, we've got Butterfly Dagger Elmo, which is another new inclusion from Dark Crisis. And we'll be discussing why this card is on this list later in the video. But basically, it can enable sort of like infinite loops, like not quite infinite, but like infinite enough, that this card is very degenerate in the right hands. For the traps, we got Imperial Order, which shuts down your opponent's spells, which is very, very strong, especially since it's a one-sided floodgate. This is actually one of my least favorite cards in the DM era. And I think, even the other like Power 5 or any powerful spells that you might have, they sort of pale in comparison to the power of one player opening IO and the other not. I think this card is very, very degenerate. I think it deserves its spot on this list, and so I'm happy to see it still here. Next up, we got Call of the Haunted, which is more revival, very, very strong. We've got Ceasefire here as well, which limits burn decks a bit, but Ceasefire still sees play in sort of anti-flip side deck tools, so I think this card probably deserves to be at 1. It lets more decks into the format and also curbs the power of a very degenerate deck. Next up, we got Mirror Force, which is mass board removal. You can play around it, but having this at only 1 copy makes it easier to play around and less frustrating. So that way, you're not just running into constant Mirror Forces. Next up, we got Magic Cylinder, which again curbs the power of burn. But honestly, this card probably doesn't need to be on this list. It's sort of underpowered compared to a lot of the other traps here. Next up, we got Reckless Greed, which, is sort of limiting the power of sort of combo decks, as there are some decks that just really do just want to draw as many cards as possible to end the game as quickly as possible. And to those decks, skipping the next 2 draw phases doesn't really matter. And lastly, for the limited cards, we've got Ring of Destruction, which is a very, very powerful removal trap that also deals damage. And the effect on screen is not quite accurate, as that is the later errata. This card is just, you target a card on field, a face-up card that is, destroy it, both players take damage to the attack that it actually had on field. And you can activate this at any time. It can cause draws, it can kill your opponent, etc. So it is very, very strong. Next up, for the semi-limited cards, we've got a card that was limited, now coming to semi-limited status, and that is Morphing Jar. Now, Morphing Jar was limited because it paired with the Empty Jar strategy, but honestly, looking at a lot of the decks in the past couple formats that we covered, Morphing Jar wasn't really getting played in those, so this card probably could come back to 2. Empty Jar isn't really the best deck. Maybe it gets like a tool or 2 here or there in this format, but like I still don't think it's really the best deck. And so I don't really think that this will be that big of a problem, but I'll be experimenting with Empty Jar probably just to see if increasing the number of Morphing Jars you get actually makes that big of a difference in the deck. Next up, we got Morphing Jar number 2, which is a semi-limited card for Empty Jar as well. And honestly, I think this is probably the more powerful Empty Jar tool than Morphing Jar. So if this card was already at 2, makes sense to have Morphing Jar at 2 as well. But yeah, this card can cause your opponent to mill a lot of cards here, and it's just very, very good. Next up, we've got Marauding Captain. Now, this card probably doesn't really deserve to be on this semi-limited list. It's here because there is a lock you can do where if you have 2 Marauding Captains on field, your opponent can't attack any of your warrior monsters, and if you're playing 2 of these, you're probably playing a warrior deck. I don't really think that combo is that strong, given that things like, Dark Hole Raigeki exist, but it is there, and it is somewhat degenerate, so it makes sense why it's at 2. Next up, we got Nobleman of Crossout. Very, very powerful spell to destroy and banish set monsters. And so it makes sense that this is at 2 because this is just a generically good card, but it is somewhat fair. There are ways to play around it. And it does curb some very degenerate flip strategies. Next up, we got Creature Swap. I think this card is probably a bit underpowered to be on the list. There are things you can do with it, like, giving an opponent like a recruiter that you then attack into and you get the search off it. But I think that ultimately, that combo does take a bit to set up and it's not really the best. So I don't really think this card necessarily deserves to be on the list here, but I can see why they put it here. Next up, we got Reinforced from the Army, gives a major boost to warrior decks, or just decks that are playing a couple of very good warriors, for instance, like Exiled Force. And this card is just extremely good, and it should be at 2 because it's a major consistency booster. And lastly, we got Last Turn. This is another very degenerate trap. That's an alt win con. It's kind of complicated, so I'm not going to go through it all here, but it leads to a very degenerate sort of combo and style of play. So this card's at 2 because it's not really easily searchable, and that does limit the power of that deck quite a bit. But that's the limited list for this format, and I hope that was pretty comprehensive, even if you haven't really seen my other coverage of these past DM era formats. But, what is a limit list without the new cards in the format and knowing what's around in the card pool? So now that I've covered the list, let's dive into those new cards that were introduced in Vampire format, coming from Breaker format. So, of course, the main additions to the card pool came from the new booster pack, Dark Crisis, but there were some other promo cards that got introduced in Vampire format. So let's just talk about them quickly. I don't think any of them are super game-changing. There's one that might see play in some side decks, but I think overall, these cards probably won't see too much play. So I'm just going to talk about them in their own section. Firstly, we've got 3 video game promos, the first being Windstorm of Etiqua. This is a normal trap that changes the battle position of all face-up monsters your opponent controls. This can be used in some stall decks, I guess, if your opponent's attacking in with a bunch of attack position monsters. You fire this, they switch to defense, you protect your life points for a turn, I guess. But there are probably better stall traps that you can use instead. Next up, we've got Anti-Spell Fragrance. Now, this is a card that might potentially see play in some side decks. I could see this being brought in potentially against like Scientist FTK, because, that deck really does want to, activate its last wills, activate its spells to get into its combo, and this sort of shuts that down. There's a continuous trap that says both players must set spell cards before activating them and cannot activate them until their next turn after setting them. So, I could see it as an anti-Scientist tech. I don't really think it will see play much beyond that. But people have surprised me before, and there probably are some other uses for this card that I'm not thinking of right now. So definitely, let me know down in the comments if you can think of one. Next up, we got Thousand Knives, which is a tool for the Dark Magician deck. There's a normal spell that says if you control Dark Magician, target one monster your opponent controls, destroy that target. Now, I think this is kind of bricky in the Dark Magician deck, and I think, if you've got Dark Magician on field already, that can probably destroy most of your opponent's monsters. Now, of course, this can snipe face-down monsters, which is nice, and can prevent things like Mystic Tomato or like Magician of Faith from going off. So that's a good use of this card. But I think ultimately, if you don't have Dark Magician on the field, this is going to be a bit of a brick, and that deck already bricks enough, so I'm not really sure this is worth playing, although it's definitely something that you can consider. And lastly, we've actually got a Duelist League participation card, I think. This wasn't in a video game, but it came out at the end of 2003, beginning of 2004, and that is Machine King. Now, Machine King is a level 6 machine monster with 2200 attack that gains 100 attack for each machine-type monster on the field, including itself. So at base, it's 2300. If you're playing other machines, it will boost up its attack. But, you'd have to be playing, 2 other machines on your field to get this up to Summon Skull levels, so I'm not really sure that's worth it. I mean, it can pair with limiter removal, so that's nice. But so can Jinzo, and Jinzo's probably just the better machine all around. So I don't really think this card will see much play, but it is an iconic card, so I figured that I'd mention it here. And now that we've covered the promos, let's dive into Dark Crisis proper and see the major additions to the card pool. Now, I call this section the generally good section, and that's kind of like a misnomer. I don't really think that all the cards that I'll talk about in this section are super good and should be in every deck. It's just that these are the cards that I think are generally good, so I could see a deck playing it because it's oh, this could have some utility in this general good stuff deck. So, I'm not trying to vouch for all these cards, but I do think that this is the best place to talk about them, and some of them are legitimately good and should see play in most decks. So let's start with one of those, the first being DD Warrior Lady. Now, this is probably the most impactful monster that got released in this set, and it is at 3 copies. It's not on the limited list, so you can play as many as you want of it. It's a warrior, which means it's searchable off a reinforcement in the army, which just makes that card even better. And it's a 1500 attack point monster with 1600 defense. It says after damage calculation, when this card battles an opponent's monster, you can banish that monster, also banish this card. So, this is sort of one-for-one removal, which might make it seem a little bit worse than some of the other monsters out there. But the banishing actually is very, very important. For instance, I mentioned Vampire Lord in the limited list section of this video, and this card, when it's destroyed, it comes back. but DD Warrior Lady banishes it. So if you do need a way to clear Vampire Lord, DD Warrior Lady is that way. This card also deals with things like Mystic Tomato or Sangan or Witch of the Black Forest. There's just so many things that this card hits. And also, it's got a decent attack stat. Like 1500 is not bad. Of course, most of the beaters in this format do get over this. But 1600 defense is also not bad. So if you set this card, your opponent summons out a breaker, uses the counter, then attacks in, this card actually will withstand that attack, and you can sort of choose whether to banish the breaker or not. So I think this card is extremely, extremely good. I think it should see play in pretty much every deck that's trying to get aggressive with like battling. But I do think that, like, unfortunately, this card does make the namesake of this format a lot worse. Now, that being said, I think the Vampire Lord is still good. It's good enough to talk about in this section. But I do think that, like, it's just not as good as it could have been. And, I'll mention it here. I think this could be an interesting, like, tribute monster to play in a good stuff deck. Of course, you could just play it in the devoted zombie list, and that probably is where this card would shine the most. But being at one copy is just, like, very underwhelming. And I honestly think there are probably other zombies that you could play in the zombie list as well. So I'm not the biggest fan of Vampire Lord in this format. A lot of the modern deck lists that have come about from exploring this format have sort of cut Vampire Lord entirely. And it's a shame, given it is the namesake of this format, but it does make a lot of sense because of DD Warrior Lady. So something you can definitely play in a good stuff deck. It's just I don't really think it's the best in a good stuff deck. But moving on to another card that I think is extremely, extremely good, it's Tsukuyomi. Now, Tsukuyomi is a spirit monster that can't be special summoned just like any other spirit monster, and also it does return to your hand during the end phase. During the turn, it was normal summoned or flip face up, just like any other spirit monster, but its effect is really, really good. When this card normal summoned or flip face up, you get to target one face up monster in the field, change that target to face down defense position, and that's all it does. But honestly, that's all it really needs to do, because a lot of monsters in this format have very weak defenses. So if you can send out Tsukuyomi, flip an opponent's monster down, you can likely hit over that monster with Tsukuyomi, and it's just, sort of continued removal. You can also reset your flip monsters as well with this card. It's just extremely, extremely versatile. It can be used sort of as a battle strike during your opponent's turn. If you set this card, your opponent attacks into it, you can set one of their other monsters. This card is just really, really versatile, really, really interesting, and I'm curious to see what people do with it. I will be discussing it more later in this video as well, but I do think it can be good just in a general good stuff deck. The next monster I want to talk about here is Reflect Bounder. Now, I mentioned it in the limited list section. I'm not really sure it belongs there, but it is still a decent card. It's a 1700 beater. That's pretty decent. It deals damage to your opponent if it's attacked. That's pretty decent. So, like, I think it could see play in a good stuff deck. I just don't think it's the best thing out there. Next up, I want to mention two monsters that represent a change in, like, stats in this format. First being Archfiends Soldier. This is now the level 4 monster that doesn't have a drawback, that has the highest attack and highest defense total, basically. Because 1900 attack was the previous record for that, with Gemini Elf having 1900 attack and 900 defense. Archfiends Soldier now outclasses that defense stat at 1500, and it's still searchable off of Witch of the Black Forest. Now, of course, Skilled Dark Magician does exist as well. That came out in Breaker format. But Skilled Dark Magician has its own flaws. Not searchable by Witch. Also, if your opponent uses like Change Fire or Snatch Steal on it, they can actually tribute it away, even if they don't have Dark Magician in their deck, to, sort of just get rid of it. If they have like 3 counters on it. So I don't really like Skilled Dark Magician for that reason. I'd much prefer Archfiends Soldier. So I think this card will probably replace Skilled Dark Magician in the decks that are playing Skilled Dark Magician instead of Gemini Elf. So it is good to know about. And also we've got Battle Footballer, which is a defensive option at 2100 defense. That is now the max stat on a level 4 monster that I could find. And, if I'm wrong about this, let me know in the comments below. But this is the new sort of record for that. So if you do want to play a defensive vanilla, Battle Footballer is now arguably your best target. And lastly, for monsters, I want to mention Iron Blacksmith Kotetsu. This is a flip monster that seems really specific, but actually can have applications in a good stuff deck. It says flip, add 1 equip spell from your deck to your hand. Now, if you're playing a deck that's based around equip spells, this is, of course, extremely good, as it can search out any of them from your deck to hand. But it can just see play in a regular good stuff deck. I mean, a lot of good stuff decks are playing Snatch Steal. This can just search that out. And maybe because this card's in the format now, decks start playing Premature Burial more. This card can also search that out. So there are some good equip spells that this card can search in just a general deck. And maybe that's worth running it. But that's something to experiment with in the future. For the spells I want to talk about here, we've got Spell Reproduction. This is the first one. This is a spell that says send 2 spells from your hand to the graveyard, then target 1 spell in your graveyard, add to your hand. Now, I don't think this is the best in a general good stuff deck because it does require a lot of investment to get back one particular spell. But normal spells are the most powerful card in this format by far. And so maybe you just want to play this anyways, just to sort of be able to get like the Raigeki back from grave or the Reborn back from grave or just some very, very powerful card back from grave. You don't really care much about the cost. So I figured I'd mention it here. I will be talking about this deck a lot throughout the video because it does pop up in a variety of more specific strategies, but I figured I'd mention it here as well. Next up, we've got Drag Down into the Grave, which probably isn't the best in a good stuff deck, but it is generally potentially good, so I figured I'd mention it here. This card says both players reveal their hand, each chooses 1 card from their opponent's hand, then you discard the chosen cards from both players' hands, then both players draw 1 card. Now, the reason I mention it here is it can potentially act as like another hand rip, sort of, because if you're going first and you have a bunch of spells or traps, you set those spells or traps, activate, drag down into the grave, you get to sort of pick what monster your opponent picks from your hand, as you can just like normal summon or set the other ones that you have, or at least the most valuable one that you have. And so you get to basically see your opponent's hand, pick the best card from it to discard, and your opponent is sort of forced to take a suboptimal discard from your end. So I think this card could have some applications in some general good stuff decks as sort of an additional hand rip, but I also think that a lot of good stuff decks don't really need the additional hand rips, and this card can actually be pretty bad for you if you desperately need to draw it, so you fire it, but your opponent takes the best card out of your hand because you just could not commit it to field. So I think this is an interesting card. I don't think we'll see too much play in sort of general good stuff decks, but it could potentially see play, as it does have some interesting applications. Next up, we've got Cost Down. Now, I think this card is actively not the best, but it is something that if you are playing Tribute Monsters, and a lot of good stuff decks are playing Tribute Monsters like Jinzo, Dark Ruler Hades, or even Vampire Lord, this card can come in handy. It says discard 1 card for the rest of this turn, reduce the level of all monsters in your hand by 2. This means that if you've got Tribute Monsters in hand that are level 6 or lower, you can fire Cost Down, then normal summon them without needing to tribute them, which can be pretty nice. However, you're still kind of tributing them because you're just discarding whatever card you'd be using to tribute instead. So it sort of just shifts where you're getting rid of a resource. Now, I do think that getting rid of a resource from hand is better than getting rid of a resource from field in this case. So I think it is better than, tribute summoning a monster normally, but you are playing an additional spell to do that as well. So you're kind of spending 2 cards instead of just 1 to bring out a tribute monster, a turn early to be fair, but like, still, is that worth it? I think that depends on you. And I don't necessarily think this card is the best out there, but I could definitely see some people thinking it's worth it enough to play in a general deck that's just playing a couple tribute monsters. Next up, we've got the traps. And first, starting with arguably one of the most iconic DM era trap cards, we've got Sakuretsu Armor. Now, Sakuretsu Armor is a battle trap that says when an opponent's monster declares an attack, target the attacking monster, destroy that target. And this isn't really the best thing in the world. Like, it's still very good, and a lot of decks will play it. It's a very, very good trap. But there are things that get around it. Things like Break the Magical Warrior could pop this. And there's just other, like, more chainable removal that you might want to play instead. But Sakuretsu Armor still is a very iconic card for a lot of people. I mean, I know when I was playing with these cards around this time, in Playground, Yu-Gi-Oh! Sort of setting, Sakuretsu Armor was insane. And so I'm sure that we'll see people experiment with this card, and maybe it will be better than I'm giving it credit for here. I think it is just a generally good effect, so you can't really go too wrong playing it in your deck as removal. But it is just sort of underwhelming compared to some of the other cards in this format. Next up, we got Judgment of Anubis, which is a very interesting counter trap. It says when your opponent activates a spell card that would destroy a spell trap on the field, discard 1 card, negate the activation. If you do destroy it, then you can destroy 1 face-up monster your opponent controls. And if you do that, inflict damage to your opponent's equal to the destroyed monster's attack on the field. So this can be sort of a way to protect your back row as well as getting rid of an opponent's monster, which seems really, really good. But it also is extremely specific. And it does require you to discard a card as well. So it's kind of like a 2-for-2 in a way, which isn't bad, but it's just like kind of just too specific for its own good. And I think that, people aren't really playing counter traps anyways. Like people aren't playing like Magic Jammer, which, this is technically better than Magic Jammer, probably in a lot of situations. But I just think it's really unnecessary. So I don't think we'll see much play, but people could experiment with it a bit. Next up, we've got Interdimensional Matter Transporter. This is a very interesting trap. Basically, you say target one face-up monster you control, banish that target until the end phase. So this can be used to protect one of your monsters from removal. There's just a bunch of application for this. It's very, very interesting. I don't necessarily think it's powerful enough to see play in a lot of decks, but it is an extremely unique card and a very interesting card that can be very versatile in a lot of situations. So I think it's cool. That's why I'm featuring it here. It can be just generically good, but I also think that it probably won't make the cut in a lot of decks in this format. Next up for the traps, we've got Skill Drain. Skill Drain says it's a continuous trap that says activate this card by paying 1,000 life points. Negate the effects of all face-up monsters while they are face-up on the field, but their effects can still be activated. Now, this card can be incredibly good. It can shut down things like DD Warrior Lady, which is a very powerful card in this format. It can shut down flip effect monsters. It can do a lot of different things. So this card is potentially very good to play in certain decks, or even just in a good stuff deck to shut down the activation of opponent's monster effect. It is a double-edged sword, though, so if you are playing it in a good stuff deck for that reason, you should probably have a way to potentially out it, or be in a position where you don't really care about using your own monster's effects. But it is still a very interesting card, a very cool card, and a card that I'm sure will see a fair amount of play in this format in a variety of strategies. Now that I've covered the new generically good cards, well, I guess there's one more that I want to cover, which is Dark Flare Knight, but this card isn't really degeneric in a lot of decks. It's just sort of another Scientist target. This card is 2200 attack. It's level 6, so you can bring it on a Scientist. But honestly, that probably won't come up much. I mean, Super Robo Yaru was already sort of filling that role. The only reason why you potentially bring out like Dark Flare Knight instead is because it plays around Skill Drain. But yeah, I mean, it's fine. It's another Scientist target. It helps out the Scientist FTK deck a little bit. But I don't know. It's just another toolbox card to add there. But not really too unique on its own. But speaking of the fusion monster, I guess I'll cover the rest of them because Science is a card in this format, Metamorphosis is a card in this format, so these fusion monsters can come up. Now, in Vampire format, you do have an unlimited fusion deck. So the 15 card limit on the extra deck, I mean, while it is required to play on like Dueling Book and stuff like that, in official play, you can sort of like fill in a proxy and say like, this is the card that I'm bringing out from my fusion deck that I don't technically have in the extra deck listed on DB. But it will serve that role. So let's just go through the other cards here. We've got Dark Bulge the Terrible, which can negate normal spells, as well as negating the effects of monsters that are destroyed. This is arguably the best of the fusion monsters you can bring out off something like Scientist or Metamorphosis. We got Fiend Skull Dragon, which can negate flip effect monsters, and also negates trap effects that target it, which can come up in a variety of situations as well. We got Ryu Sentry, which can negate normal traps, as well as negating spells that target this card specifically. We got Thousand Eyes Restrict, which can suck up an opponent's monster and remove it from the field. It also locks down the game for a bit. And it can combo with Tsukuyomi in some interesting ways, but I'll get to that later in the guide. Just know that it's not as powerful as you're probably thinking it is from something like Goat. We've also got Super Robo Lady and Super Robo Yaru. These are two monsters that are kind of linked. Super Robo Yaru gains 1,000 attack when it attacks a monster, and Super Robo Lady gains 1,000 attack when it attacks directly. So off of Scientist, Super Robo Lady is probably a bit less good. But it can have its uses, and also Metamorphosis is a card you could play to bring this card out as well. We've also got Reaper on the Nightmare. This is a level 5 fusion monster that, it can attack your opponent directly, and when it does, you can discard a card from their hand. It also can't be destroyed by battle, but if it's targeted, it will be destroyed. So this card can come up in certain situations as well. We've also got a Last Warrior from Another Planet. This card, you can't really bring it off of Scientist, and it's kind of hard to bring it off of Metamorphosis, but it can come up in certain situations. So this card shuts down all summons, and that it can just be enough to win the game on its own in some cases, although there are enough powerful spells that generally isn't the case in this format, but is still a pretty degenerate card and a card that we'll see play in certain jank strategies. Next up, we've got Punish the Eagle, Roaring Ocean Snake, and Empress Judge. These are cards that fuel the Scientist FDK. Of course, as I mentioned, Dark Flare Knight can fuel that as well now. But these cards will still see play probably in some of those Scientist decks. Next up, we've got Darkfire Dragon and Dragons of the Witching Night, which are just here for the level requirements off something like Metamorphosis or something. But it can come up in certain situations. You also sometimes want to bring out a weak monster off Scientist to crash into an opponent's monster to trigger Last Will. And that's why knowing something like Fusionist, which is the weakest fusion monster you can summon out, off of something like Scientist is good to know about. There's also like Cherubin Knight and Flame Ghost, which have 1100 and 1000 attack respectively as well. So it's good to know about those stat lines and potentially play them in your extra deck for just random situations that can come up. But generally, you won't be in those edge cases. But moving on from the Fusion deck, we've also got a bunch of other cards from previous formats that are good to know about. And I'm only going to be covering the ones not on the limited list, because if you want to know about those, you can check the limited list section of this video. But to start with, we've got Mystic Tomato and Shining Angel. Now, these are two sort of battle recruiters. They've got 1400 attack. When they're destroyed by battle, they get to fetch a monster out from the deck. Now, these get a lot worse given that DD Warrior Lady is in the format, but Shining Angel honestly probably gets a bit better now that DD Warrior Lady is in the format, because it can fetch out a DD Warrior Lady. So, these are still pretty powerful cards. I think they're sort of falling out of favor in this format because of DD Warrior Lady, but you could still potentially play them. Next up, we've got King Tiger Wanghu. This is a great sort of beater that shuts down a lot of things like your Mystic Tomatoes or your Shining Angels, although with Shining Angel, you can just bring out ADD Warrior Lady to dodge that. But it can shut down a lot of monsters, and it does shut down Scientist FTK pretty effectively. So this is often seen in side decks in Breaker format, and maybe even in main decks as well. So it could probably, serve a similar purpose here. Next up, we got Don Zalug. This was a warrior monster that was seeing a lot of play in Yada format as a hand control card. And with the rise of things like DD Warrior Lady, and probably people playing more reinforcements of the army, the Don Zalug could definitely see more favor in Vampire than it did in Breaker. Next up, we've got Gravekeeper Spy. Gravekeeper Spy is a flip monster that fetches out another Gravekeeper's from the deck when it's flipped up. And this was seeing a lot of experimentation in Yada format recently. It's been seeing some experimentation in Breaker format as well. And it likely will also be pretty good in this format too. So I think this card will see a lot more play in the future as people experiment with it more. And just 2k defense is pretty good. It walls up against a Vampire Lord at least. Next up, we've got Magician of Faith. This is a very powerful flip monster, one of the most powerful flip monsters in this format, just given the power level of spells. And this can be very, very good. Just recovering something like a Raigeki or a Dark Hole, or just something very, very strong from your graveyard. And lastly, for the monster that I want to talk about here, we've got Bazoo the Soul Eater. This is sort of fallen out of favor in a lot of decks, but it still can be good. Its effect only banishes monsters in this format, so once per turn you can banish up to 3 monsters from your graveyard. This card gains 300 attack for each until the end of your opponent's turn. And that can potentially be good to like out something like a Jinzo or just a big monster. So this card can come up, but it's more sort of been relegated to the side deck in a lot of decks in this format, or at least in past formats. So I don't really think it'll see too much play, but it is good to know about. And next up for the spells, we got Mystical Space Typhoon, which is arguably the most important spell, not on the limited list in this format. This card is really, really good. It can shut off things like Skill Drain. It can also shut off your own Mirages of Nightmare, Imperial Order. There's just a lot of different applications for this card. Also, Giant Trunade is legal in this format at 3 copies, which, people haven't really been playing with it much in things like Breaker format or Yada format. But it is potentially a good card here, especially if you are going for the Kotetsu build. Playing Premature Burial, Giant Trunade can make you, sort of reuse your Premature Burial, which is pretty nice. Next up, we've got Book of Moon. Book of Moon can be a very versatile card in this format. Flips down an opponent's monster, flips down one of your own monsters, you reuse the flip effect. A lot of different uses for this card. Very, very good card in general. And also can get through Jinzo as well, as it is a quick play spell. Next up, we got Metamorphosis. Now, this has been seeing some experimentation in like Yada format and potentially Breaker format as well, although there it's mainly used in Scientist FTK to, trigger a Last Will or to potentially set up a Balter for future turns. But this card is still pretty decent. I expect to see some experimentation here as well, and I'm curious to see what people will do with it. Next up, we've got the traps. Firstly, let's talk about Royal's Decree. This is a continuous trap that negates all of their trap effects on the field. This can be used to shut down something like your opponent's like Sakuratsu Armors or things like that. It can also be used to shut down sort of trap-focused decks like Burn. So this can be a very good side deck card against that. And given that Burn did get a bit more powerful in this format, I think this card will see more play here. Next up, we got Torrential Tribute. This is a great sort of board clear if your opponent summons a monster, or if you summon a monster as well. There are situations where you want to do that. And it can be good to sort of like trigger your Vampire Lords, because, this will destroy that, although it has to be an opponent's card effect, so you can't trigger it on your own. But if you're bringing out Vampire Lord, then TT looks pretty bad. And sometimes your opponent will just have to TT that, even though it's really bad for them. So still a good trap in general. And I'm curious to see how this gets played, whether people play all 3 copies or if they mix it up and sort of substitute other traps instead. Something like maybe Raigeki Break. Raigeki Break is a normal trap that lets you discard a card, then target 1 card on the field and destroy it. This is a very versatile removal option. And if you're playing something like Sinister Serpent, this sort of pairs perfectly with that. However, it can potentially be bad if you're in a top deck situation. So a lot of decks don't really play it that much. But I do think it could definitely see experimentation in this format, especially given how good it is into Science FTK. And lastly, I want to mention Jar of Greed. Jar of Greed has been seeing some experimentation in formats past. It's just a very basic trap. It draws you 1 card. But that can be good enough. It can bait out your opponent's spell and trap removal, and so you get a card and your opponent's wasted a card, and just be a good cycler all around. So I think that this card is still worth considering, or at least having on your radar in this format. But now that we've covered all these sort of generically good cards, let's dive into some of the fun archetypes and specific strategies that Dark Crisis had. Because Dark Crisis did introduce some of them, even if they aren't really that good. So if you've seen some of my previous guides, you might wonder why I'm starting by talking about the Guardians. Because normally I save sort of the least good archetypes for later in the video after I've covered all the good cards. And the reason I'm covering the Guardians now is because this format did not really introduce any good new archetypes. It introduced some interesting new strategies that can be good, but the archetypes themselves in Dark Crisis were really, really bad. Guardians is the worst of the 2 archetypes introduced, so, or I guess there were technically 3 archetypes introduced, but like, it's definitely still the worst of them. But it does segue into another sort of discussion about some powerful new strategies that this set introduced. So I figured I'd talk about the Guardians first. And, it's just such a shame because the Guardians were so cool in the anime. And I do think that there is some potential about theming an archetype around like these specific equipped cards that pair with certain monsters. But this just was not the way to do it. So every Guardian has a certain condition where they have a specific equip spell related to them. And they can't be summoned unless you control a face-up version of that equip spell. Now, so for instance, looking at Guardian Bow, this card cannot be summoned unless you control a face-up Wicked Breaking Flamberge Bow, which is an equip spell that you activate by sending 1 card from your hand to the graveyard, then target 1 monster on the field. Equip this target to that card, it gains 500 attack, negate the effects of opponent's monsters destroyed by battle with the equipped monster. So that is a very good effect on equip spell, but you need to actually activate it first before Bow hits the field, which means that you likely have to have one of your own monsters on field to do this. But if you're playing only Guardian monsters, then that doesn't quite work because, you need to actually have a monster on field to do it with, and they can't be summoned until you have one of your crypt spells out. So it's a really, really weird strategy. It just does not quite work. You can play other monsters instead to pair with it, and that can help you out a little bit, but it's still very, very awkward, which is a shame because some of these effects are very good. Like, for instance, Bow, when it sends an opponent's monster the graveyard by battle, it gains 1,000 attack, and it negates the effects of monsters destroyed by battle with this card. That is incredibly good. We've seen from things like Dark Balls for the Terrible and Dark World Hades that monster negation effect is super, super strong. And, being able to gain 1,000 attack, like, whenever it destroys a monster by battle, very, very good. But unfortunately, because it has that restriction with the Wicked Breaking Flamberge, it just is not quite the best. Now, arguably your best sort of starter for this deck is actually Guardian Seal. And, if you start with Guardian Seal, you can sort of get this sort of momentum going, which can help out a little bit, but it's still kind of awkward. So the reason why Guardian Seal is arguably the best one to start out with is because of its equip spell, Shooting Starbow Seal. Shooting Starbow Seal is an equip spell that decreases the equip monster attack by 1,000, but it can attack your opponent directly. So you can use this on some of your own monsters to get in a fair amount of damage by attacking directly. But where this card shines is you equip it to an opponent's monster, that monster loses 1,000 attack, you summon out Guardian Seal, attack over that monster, and then you've got a monster on your side of the field that you can equip your other Guardian spells to, and then bring out your other monsters like Guardian Bow, for instance. Guardian Seal itself has a very interesting effect that also pairs well with the sort of other Guardian equipped spells. It says you can send one equipped spell card you control that is equipped to this card to the graveyard to target one monster your opponent controls and destroy that target. So they compare pretty decently well. If you are already equipping spells to this card and then sending out monsters, you can then send them to the grave. Now, unfortunately, I'm sure a lot of people are seeing this and they're thinking, whoa, that's actually crazy given one of the other Guardian equip spells in this format. But unfortunately, it sends and it does not destroy. So it will not work with something like Butterfly Dagger Elma, which is an equip spell that says the equipped monster gains 300 attack. When this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard while equipped, you can return this card to the hand. So you can't just pull off an infinite combo with like Guardian Butterfly Dagger Elma and Guardian Seal, where you're just destroying all your opponent's monsters. Unfortunately, they were like, that's too powerful for this archetype, and so it did not work. I mean, honestly, this archetype's bad enough that I feel like you could give that to them and this would still be fine, but nope. They were like, we got to cut that off, and I guess I respect them for that in some degree, but yeah, I feel like it could have definitely been doable here. The Guardian for Elma is also pretty good. It only got 1300 attack, which is kind of unfortunate, but when it's normal summoned or special summoned, you can target one appropriate equipped spell card in your graveyard and equip that target to this card. So this card can also sort of fuel your Guardian strategy. For instance, like if you've already used up a shooting Starbow Seal on an opponent's monster and gone through that, but your opponent destroys your first seal, you can summon that Elma, equip seal to it, and then bring in another seal with something like Reborn or Call of the Haunted or something. Now, that obviously wouldn't be the best because then Elma loses 1,000 attack, but you could do that with like any of your Guardian spells. I think that if you do that with like Wicked Breaking, Flamberge Bow, you wouldn't have to send the card from hand to graveyard. So I think that, there are some benefits to using Elma in this way. The fact that, if the game's gone on long enough and you've got enough equip spells in the grave, this can be used as sort of a toolbox thing. Can be good as well. But yeah, it's just, it's a shame because, the summoning restriction is so stringent that it like really hampers a lot of the cool stuff that this deck could do. Another very cool monster in this deck is Guardian Grawl. This pairs with the equipped spell Gravity Axe Grawl, which says the equipped monster gains 500 attack, and monsters your opponent controls cannot change their battle position, which can come up in certain situations. But honestly, like if you're getting aggressive with this deck, it probably won't be the most important thing in the world. Grawl, though, is very cool. It's level 5, so you do have to tribute it out if you summon it normally, but it has an effect that says if this card is the only card in your hand, you can special summon it from your hand. And given that basically this deck revolves around playing at least 2 cards a turn, you likely will often find yourself in situations where you have like no cards in hand, unless you're bricking on other Guardians, which, that just stinks because that's really, really unfortunate. But like, this is kind of cool. It lets you get another monster on field, get super aggressive, and 2,500 attack is a pretty good attack stat. Honestly, like, you could potentially play this in a regular deck, not playing any of the other Guardians, just playing, like, some Guardian Axe Gralls, maybe an Iron Blacksmith Kotetsu, and then just having this monster as a special summonable 2,500 attack point beater. Like, that seems pretty decent to me, but honestly, it'll probably brick you up more than it'll help you in most situations. Next up, we got some of the really bad Guardians, in my opinion. First up, we've got Chaos. So let's start with the Rod of Silence Chaos. There's an equipped spell that says the equipped monster gains 500 defense, negate other spell effects that target the equipped monster, and if you do, destroy that spell card. So this is another sort of thing like Seal, where you can sort of equip it to an opponent's monster to bring out one of your own monsters, and it's not that bad being equipped to an opponent's monster because it doesn't really give them the biggest benefits in the world. And can actually somewhat help you if you're up against certain decks that actually do want to target their own monster with spells. But I think overall it's kind of bad. And also it really does not play well with the other Guardian cards. Like, for instance, if you're going for a play where you're bringing out both Chaos and Grawl in one turn, and you equip like Chaos to an opponent's monster, like, you can't then equip Grawl to that monster. I mean, you could potentially summon out Chaos anyways, and then just equip Grawl to Chaos. But like, Chaos is unaffected by spell effects, so it's not really the best use of your resources there. So I don't know, it just feels like an anti-synergy to me. But speaking of the monster Chaos, it's unaffected by spell effects, which can be pretty good, as things like Dark Hole or Raigeki won't really help out with this. And it can't be targeted for attacks, which is also pretty nice. Although, since it can't be targeted for attacks, your opponent will be attacking you directly if this card is face up on the field. Now, I do also want to mention, like, Guardian Chaos brings up a very interesting loophole for the Guardian monsters. They can't be summoned unless you control the face of equipped spells, but they can be set. And when you have something like Chaos, which has 1800 defense, that will withstand a lot of attacks from other monsters in this format. So one thing you can do is like set Chaos as your opening play, and then once it's on field, you can equip your other spells to it and bring out your other Guardians. But as I said, this card is unaffected by spell effects. So, that won't necessarily be the best for you. Although it won't be terrible either. The last Guardian monster here kind of pairs with Chaos in an interesting way, and that is Guardian Trice. The Guardian Trice cannot be summoned unless you control a face-up Twin Swords of Flashing Light Trice, which we'll get to in a second. But when this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, special summon the monster from the graveyard that was used for its tribute summon. Now, I wanted to talk about this before getting to the equip spell, because I think the equip spell is not that bad. However, Trice itself is absolutely terrible in this deck. So, 99 attack is already not the best stat on a tribute monster unless you've got a really good effect, something like Air Knight Parshath, for instance. But its effect here is absolutely terrible for this deck because you won't even be able to special summon a Guardian monster that you tribute if the equip spell to bring out that Guardian monster is not on field anymore. So this card just, like, I don't know, this is really, really bad to me. Like, this sort of is anti-synergistic with most of the deck. Like, I think this card is really, really bad. One of the worst of the Guardian monsters, if not the worst Guardian monster here. And I think even if you're playing a Guardian strategy, it's like not even worth considering this monster. It's just so, so bad. Now, Twin Swords of Flashing Light Trice is actually a decent equip spell. It says send one card from your hand to the graveyard, just like with the Flamberge Bow. And it says equip this card to a monster. It loses 500 attack, but it can make a second attack during each battle phase. So that can actually pump out a lot of damage. For instance, if you've gotten like a Gararl on field and you equip it with Trice, then that'll be 4,000 damage going your opponent's way each turn. And you've also got other equip spells as well to pair with it. And this card can even be used in sort of just other OTK strategies. If you're already buffing up one of your monsters with a ton of equip spells, and you equip this to it, that can get in a ton of damage. So I think this card is actually a decent equip spell in certain situations. It's just like, for Trice itself, it's really, really bad. The Guardians actually did receive some other support cards as well. The main one being Arsenal Summoner. This is a flip monster that says add one Guardian card from your deck to your hand except Celtic Guardian, Winged Dragon Guardian of the Fortress number 1, Winged Dragon Guardian of the Fortress number 2, Guardian of the Labyrinth, or the Reliable Guardian. So it's mainly here just to get specifically Guardian monsters. Now, as a note, this can search out Gate Guardian, which is kind of cool for that deck. You can also search out an actually good card, which is Guardian Sphinx, or at least good relatively. Like, I don't think this card's the best, but, it's decent. It's basically a Pac-Man card that can return all monsters your opponent controls to the hand. And if you're able to set up a certain loop with this, it can be very annoying for your opponent to deal with. But I'm not really sure it's worth playing Arsenal Summoner to search this thing out, but it is kind of an interesting option that you can use in this deck here. And 1600 attack, 1600 defense, those are decent stats. This card might survive. So if you search out, like, Guardian Sphinx, it could be decent. I guess if you pair this with Guardian Trice, it's not terrible because you're able to tribute out Guardian Trice and you get back an actual monster that can be summoned with Trice. But I don't even think it's really worth it in that way. And next up, we got Iron Blacksmith Kotetsu, which is basically made for this deck. You search out whatever Guardian equip spell you need, and, you sort of pair it with the monsters in hand. So I think this card, an instant 3 of in this deck, honestly, because it's just so vital to the deck overall. But there were also some just, like, generic equip support cards in this set. Fairy of the Spring, it lets you target one equip spell in your graveyard, add that target to your hand, but it can't be activated that turn, so it's kind of awkward. But, just having Guardian spells back can be pretty decent, I guess. Unfortunately, this set thought the Guardians would be too strong. And so it included some actually anti-equip spells support for them. First up is really Eternal Rest, which is a play off of Eternal Rest, which actually Eternal Rest is something you could probably use in this deck. If you're equipping your opponent's monsters with equip spells, and then you fire Eternal Rest, that is kind of a board clear. And I guess really Eternal Rest could also be used in a similar way. It's a trap that says destroy all monsters equipped with an equip card. So you could use this in the Guardian deck to pop your opponent's monsters. But given that you're probably equipping a lot of Guardian equip spells to your own monsters as well, for instance, like Seal does that, you don't necessarily want to play this card in all situations. Same with Eternal Rest. And this also is very good for your opponent, like, as a side deck tech against Guardians. I'm not sure really why they felt the need to print this card in the same set as Guardians, and they clearly intended this to be used with the Guardian cards, given, like, all the equip spells in this art are from the Guardian equip spells. So, I don't know, it's just kind of a funny sort of thing here. But yeah, it's just like kicking a deck while it's down a little bit, in my opinion. Spell Reproduction is also a card in the set that can be used with the Guardian deck, because you probably will be bricking on some of the equipped spells. So you can just use this to get back one that you need while sending 2 to the graveyard that you don't necessarily need. Magician of Faith can also be used to get back equipped spells, which is pretty good. But yeah, it's just kind of awkward. There are some other interesting monsters that you can use in conjunction with these cards. I would say Cyber Raider is not one of them, although I initially thought it was, which is why I put it here, because I could imagine people looking at this card and being like, hey, that card's actually great in the Guardians deck. It says if the card is summoned, activate one of these effects, target one equipped spell card on the field, destroy that target, or target one equipped card on the field, equip that target to this card. Now, initially, when reading this, and I also was thinking this because generally when I do these guides, I look at every card and I'm like, okay, what is the best possible way this could be used? So I was thinking like, oh, if you're equipping your opponent's monster with things like Gravity X Grarl, you can then summon out Cyber Raider and equip it to Cyber Raiders. So, that's a way to both get out Grarl and also equip the card to your own monster. However, you could just summon out a normal monster and equip it with the equip spell. Like, you don't need Cyber Raider for that. And I don't know, Cyber Raider is just kind of like actively worse than pretty much any other monster in the format. And so I don't really think that this card is that good in this deck, even though it might at first glance appear to be. Lastly, I also want to mention Arsenal Robber. This card isn't really that bad against this deck. Honestly, if your opponent played it against this deck, you probably wouldn't be that unhappy. It says your opponent selects one equipped spell card from his or her deck and sends it to the graveyard. So, I mean, this just, if you're the Guardian player, you get to send whatever equipped spell you want to the graveyard. Maybe you combine it with Fairy to Spring or Spell Reproduction or Magician of Faith. And you feel pretty good about that, honestly. So this card is really bad in pretty much every situation. I mean, I guess you could use it against like a good stuff deck. If you think they're only on one copy of Snatch Steal, you force that Snatch Steal to go to grave. Maybe they're not playing Magician of Faith. Maybe they can't get it back. That's one very good top deck out of their deck. But honestly, instead of Arsenal Robber, I'd rather just play Dust Tornado, a card that also deals with Snatch Steal, but also deals with other cards potentially as well. So, yeah, I think that Arsenal Robber is not really that good here, but I figured I'd mention it given I was discussing other equip spell cards, sort of support things. But that's going to do it for the Guardians. Now, as I mentioned, this is a really, really bad archetype. I probably will be exploring it at one point, though, because it is sort of fun just to go back and try and make a, sort of competent rogue deck out of something this bad. But yeah, this is a pretty miserable, probably the most miserable of the other archetypes, maybe slightly better than one other archetype, but we'll get to those when we get to those. The main reason I wanted to talk about these first is because Butterfly Dagger Elma really does find itself at the center of a lot of degenerate decks that you can actually make in this format. So I figured this would be a good way to segue into talking about some of the more degenerate decks in this format. Now, while Dark Crisis may not have been the best for archetypes, it did release some very degenerate win cons, or at least cards that aid in degenerate win cons. So I figured I'd talk about them here. A lot of these are FTKs, but I'll also talk about Burn and some other alt win cons that were released in this set. Now, first off, if we're talking about FTKs, I gotta start by mentioning the Scientist FTK. So, Scientist FTK, it was a random breaker format. Basically, if you get out Scientist and Catapult Turtle on your field on the first turn of the game, you can just burn your opponent to death by bringing out powerful fusion monsters that you then tribute off with Turtle, and that will actually wind up being exactly 8,000. Now, with Dark Flare Knight, it can actually be a little bit more, although not by much, so not really a sort of super reasonable sort of advantage for this deck, but it is something good to know. And this deck is still around and still taking names in this format. Last Will is a bit worse than it is in Breaker format because of a rulings change that happened in December. So this card actually has to be activated before your monster gets sent to the graveyard to see use. Of course, this ruling didn't really affect the Scientist decks as much because they're trying to go off on the first turn anyways. So, they can control when their monsters get sent to the graveyard in the combo. But it can affect other decks that do want to play with Last Will. So I think it does sort of limit the power of Last Will a lot for a lot of decks that would want to play it. And so it is important to talk about there. Also, I do want to mention spell reproduction again. This card can be used for the Scientist's FTK because, the deck does play some things like, Giant Trunade or Heavy Storm, etc., which aren't really the most useful on the first turn. They're there for like going second and things. So if you're setting up the combo on the first turn and you sort of get like a last will in the graveyard or something, you can use spell reproduction, pitch those, get back the last will, activate it again, and then do something like a Cannon Soldier or something to bring out, both Scientist and Turtle at the same time. So there are some, applications for spell reproduction in the Scientist deck here. But the main sort of degeneracy I want to talk about is the Elma FTKs. So Elma is a very interesting equip spell. Once destroyed, it goes back to your hand. The 300 attack can come up, but not really often, because the main way you're using this card was something like Gearfried the Iron Knight. Gearfried the Iron Knight is a monster that destroys any equipped spells equipped to it. So basically what you do is you summon Gearfried, equip Elma, pop Elma, get it back to hand, equip to Gearfried again, and so on and so forth. You might be wondering, like, what's the point of this combo? Well, if you also have a Royal Magical Library on the field, which can be brought out with Last Will, so that can come up, then this gives you infinite draws. So if you're playing a deck that is a win con, sort of revolving around drawing into certain things, like Exodia, for instance, you can actually do the Elma FTK, summon out Gearfried, get out Royal Magical Library through some means of Last Will or something, and then draw infinite cards with that and go for Exodia. Now, this is a lot less consistent than something like the Science FTK, in my opinion, so I don't really think it's the best, but it is something you can do, and it's just another sort of avenue towards degeneracy that you can go down here. Also, I do want to mention there is another sort of, not FTK, but yeah, I guess neither of these are really FTKs, but like sort of infinite combo that you can do to kill your opponent with just sort of Gearfried and Elma and a couple other cards. And that is using a new spell called Morale Boost, which is a continuous spell. So each time a player equips an equipped spell card, increase the life points of the controller of that equipped spell by 1,000 points. Each time an equipped spell card is removed from the field, control of that equipped spell card takes 1,000 points of damage. And you can pair this with something like Fire Princess, which is a monster that says each time you gain life points, inflict 500 damage to your opponent. So what you can do is you can sort of just keep equipping Butterfly Dagger Elma to Gearfried the Iron Knight, have Morale Boost and Fire Princess up. You gain life points from Morale Boost. You also go back down, but the main key there is that your life points are staying the same at the end of the combo, and Fire Princess is burning your opponent for 500 damage throughout that combo. So this will be able to deal theoretically an infinite amount of damage to your opponent, which should be more than enough to kill them. So those are sort of the two main combos with Gearfried and Elma that you can come up with. I'm sure with infinite draws, there are other things you can do as well with this, but that's the main thing. Now, those are sort of the flashiest FTK combos in this format, but there is actually a card that's released that really ties together another FTK that you can do, and that is Archfiends Oath. Now, looking at Archfiends Oath, you might initially not really get why this is an FTK enabler. It's a continuous spell that says once per turn, you can pay 500 life points, then declare one card name, activate the top card of your deck, and if it is the declared card, add it to your hand, otherwise sent to the graveyard. And this card is a centerpiece of a very, very complicated FTK deck known as Library FTK. Basically, the idea with this is you've got Library up on field. You use a lot of like continuous spells like Archfiends Oath and Convulsion of Nature, which will let you guaranteed call Archfiends Oath correctly. And because Archfiends Oath is a soft once per turn, if you use something like Giant Trunade to return Archfiends Oath and like Convulsion of Nature back to hand, then you sort of get to do it again. And also, you're getting counters on Royal Magical Library from all these spell activations, so you can draw additional cards as well. And basically, throughout that combo, you're also potentially playing continuous spells like Toon World, which will burn you even more. And so throughout that combo, you're trying to get down to around 500 life points. So that way you can actually win the game using Reversal Quiz and Black Pendant. Black Pendant's an equip spell that can pair with your Trunades as well. But if you equip it to the Royal Magical Library at the end of your combo, and then fire a Reversal Quiz, and you call Reversal Quiz right, then your life points will switch with your opponent, so your opponent will then be at 500 life points. Then the effect of Black Pendant will activate as you have to send all cards in your hand and on your side of the field to the graveyard to use Reversal Quiz. And so that will indeed, trigger Black Pendant and deal your opponent 500 damage. So that will indeed kill them. Now, this sort of combo is not as effective as it is in later formats like GOAT. It is missing things like Toon Table of Contents, which does help out the deck quite a bit. but it's still a very, very formidable FTK, and I will be testing it out to see how consistent it actually is in this format, and whether lacking things like Tune Table of Contents or Reload, etc., whether all that really makes the deck, not really worth playing and not really that consistent. But I am very curious to see how it goes. Next up, I want to talk about Burn. Burn is probably the most typical degenerate strategy that you'll see in all these formats. It's been around since the start of the game's history. And Burn received two very powerful tools that may not really seem like Burn tools here. First of them is Ojamatrio. Ojamatrio is a normal trap. Special summons 3 Ojama tokens to your opponent's side of the field in defense position. It cannot be tributed for a tribute summon, and each time one is destroyed, its controller takes 300 damage. And that may seem a bit weird, because it doesn't really burn them for that much, only 300 when the tokens are destroyed. But the main reason you're giving your opponent tokens is to boost up their field presence and boost up the sort of amount of cards they control entirely to make your things like Secret Barrel and Justice Desserts a lot more powerful. Also, your opponent having a lot of monsters on their side of the field is much better for Gyakugiri Panda, which is a new monster that starts out with 800 attack, but it gains 500 attack for each monster on your opponent's side of the field. And when it attacks with an attack that is higher than the defense of an opponent's defense position monster, you get to inflict the difference as battle damage to your opponent's life points. So, if you've activated Ojama Trio, set up 3 Ojama tokens on your opponent's side of the field, then this Gyakugiri Panda will have 2300 attack. Attacking into a token will deal 1300 damage, so that is extremely good. It can also attack under things like Gravity Bind, which you might be playing to sort of stop your opponent's offensive pressure. So I think that, Ojama Trio is a very, very important card for Burn. I'm very excited to experiment with Burn further and see if this actually makes the deck, potentially as good as it is in something like Goat, where, it's not the best deck in Goat, but it's still pretty competent. And so I'm curious to see if it will be pretty competent in this format as well. Now, the last sort of card that I want to mention here that contributes to the sort of alternate win cons and degenerate strategies is Final Countdown. This is a normal spell that says pay 2,000 life points after 20 turns have passed. After you activate this card, counting the turn you activate this card at the first turn, you win the duel. So that's a very, very powerful effect if you're able to pull it off. And there are some stall tools that you can use for this card. Things like Thunder of Ruler can be nice, as Thunder of Ruler, skips the battle phase of your opponent's turn. This turn's activated. You've also got Woboka to protect your life points. You've got the new card Frozen Soul, and Frozen Soul is a normal trap that says you can only activate this card when your life points are at least 2,000 lower than your opponent's. Skip your opponent's next battle phase, which can be very nice at sort of keeping yourself alive throughout all this. I will also mention that there is a card that can pair with Final Countdown, which is kind of funny, which is Pyroclock of Destiny. This is a normal trap that came out a while ago. It says move the turn count forward by 1. The turn in which this card is activated continues as normal. So this can also sort of increase the clock on Final Countdown. Although I feel like if you're actually running a Final Countdown deck, you probably don't want to use Pyroclock. You want to use cards that will keep you alive for longer and be more consistent that way. But it is a card you can run in that. And it's cool to see this card actually receive some use. But that's going to do it for the more degenerate part of this video. There are things like Last Turn out there that is also very degenerate, but didn't really receive any new tools in this set, so I didn't really mention it here. But this should be more than enough for the degenerates out there to get cooking and just have ideas for where to go in this format. So very, very cool to see. I am a degenerate myself, so I'm excited to experiment with these. But moving away from the degenerate strategies, there are also some more standard strategies as well. So let's dive into another one of the archetypes that Dark Crisis introduced. The Archfiends are a really cool set of monsters on paper, but they've just got so many problems in practice that they're not really worth playing. Now, the Archfiends all sort of share the fact that they're fiends, and also they have a strict maintenance cost. So, basically, in order to keep them around, you have to pay a certain amount of life points during each of your standby phases. And this is something that can't really be negated with things like skill drain. So, this was a combo that when I was a kid, I was like, oh boy, I can play Archfiends if I just activate skill drain, then they won't have to pay life points every turn and I'll be fine. But it does not work that way since these are maintenance costs. So, that means that this is a very dangerous strategy to play. It can drop your life points down very, very low. And also, unfortunately, I don't really think the power level of this strategy justifies that cost. But there are ways to mitigate that that we'll cover, after we cover all the monsters. Now, the centerpiece of the Archfiend strategy is this monster, Terror King Archfiend. Level 4 monster with 2,000 attack, 1,500 defense, but it can't be normal summoned or flip summoned unless you control an Archfiend monster. Now, there are some monsters in the game that are Archfiend monsters that you might not expect, things like Summon Skull or something, but there aren't any monsters that you typically have on field that, are just surprisingly Archfiend. So, This will likely just be one of the monsters sort of arrayed in front of you here. But this card says once per turn during your standby phase, you must pay 800 life points. This is not optional, or this card is destroyed. When resolving an opponent's card effect, the target of this card roll a 6-sided die and negate that effect. If you roll a 2-5, or that's it. And if you do destroy that card, negate the effect of effect monster destroyed by battle with this card. And you know, again, as I mentioned before in the Guardian section of this video, that is a very, very strong effect. So, you know, that's pretty decent on this card. It's got good stats at 2,000. The only thing is that, like, it's just so hard to bring out. You have to have an Archfiend already on field. And even then, it's like, it's kind of iffy. And there are a lot of things that can stop this. It does protect itself from targeting 1/3 of the time, which is nice. But things like Raigeki, Dark Hole, Mirror Force, Trench Tribute, all those play really poorly with Terror King Archfiend, and it makes it a bit of an unfortunate card in this game. But, you know, it's not the worst. 2,000 attack is nothing to scoff at, and if you can bring it out, it's very, very strong. Now, your best bet in bringing this out is probably something like Archfiend Soldier. Archfiend Soldier is just a normal monster with 900 attack. But no maintenance cost makes it really, really nice. And the fact that it is an Archfiend name does pair well with Terror King. So I think this card probably will see play in Archfiend decks, even if it doesn't really go with the gimmick that a lot of the other monsters here do. Shadow Knight Archfiend is also a decent alternative to bring out your Terror King. This is a 2,000 attack point level 4 monster. This says once per turn in your standby phase, you must pay 900 life points. So pretty steep maintenance cost. But when resolving an opponent's card effect, the targets this card, roll a 6-sided die, and if you roll a 3, it's negated and destroyed. And then any battle damage this card inflicts your opponent is halved. Now, I also think that this is one of the worst Archfiends that you can go with. I get that the 2,000 attack is kind of beefy, but in a deck like this, you really do want to be getting a lot of damage in pretty quickly. And the fact that this card halves the damage it deals is really unfortunate. And there are other monsters that can stick around instead. Something like Infernal Queen Archfiend, for instance, is probably better. It says once per turn during your standby phase, you must pay 500 life points. This is not optional. And when resolving an opponent's card effect that targets this card, roll a 6-sided die, and negate that effect if you roll a 2 or a 5. So 1/3 chance instead of 1/6 chance, like Shadow Knight. Once per turn during the standby phase, you get to target one Archfiend monster on the field. It gains 1,000 attack until the end of this turn. This is effectively a 1,900 attack point monster in a lot of cases, which makes it very similar to Archfiend Soldier. But it can also be paired with other Archfiends to get a lot of damage in. The main Archfiend that you might be pairing this with is something like Vilepon Archfiend. This is a level 2 monster, 1,200 attack. That says once per turn during your standby phase, you must pay 500 life points. This card is destroyed. When resolving an opponent's card effect that targets this card, roll a 6-sided die and negate that effect if you roll a 3, just like with Shadow Knight. But your opponent's monsters cannot attack any Archfiend monsters except for Vilepon Archfiend. So, you know, this can't quite do the Captain lock like Marauding Captain, because if you control 2 Vilepon Archfiends, I believe they can attack either of them, because it just specifies the name Vilepon Archfiend. But if you buff this attack up with your Infernal Queen Archfiend, that can be pretty decent. And, you know, it also protects your other Archfiends on field, things like potentially Dark Bishop Archfiend, which is a very, very weak Archfiend monster that says once per turn during your standby phase, you must pay 500 life points. When resolving an opponent's card effect that targets an Archfiend monster you control, roll a 6-sided die and negate that effect if you roll a 1, 3, or 6 if you destroy that card. So the fact that it guarantees protection for all your Archfiends is pretty nice, although unfortunately the overlap on things like Vilepon and Shadow Knight is kind of rough. Although, you know, it doesn't have overlap with things like Infernal Queen or Terror King, so that is pretty good. It can basically make those guaranteed negation for targeted effect, which is pretty good. Although, if you have a full board of Archfiend monsters, it is still very, very vulnerable to something like not Imperial Order, something like Raigeki or Dark Hole. So, you know, kind of a risk to build that big of a board in this format, but if you're able to get a board of something like, you know, Vilepon, Infernal Queen, and Dark Bishop, that's not bad. Although it will take some time to actually set up. The last of the Archfiend monsters that are sort of just normal summonable without a tribute is Deathstroke Archfiend. This is a level 3 Archfiend monster with 1,100 attack, 1,800 defense, so pretty decent stats there. And once per turn during your standby phase, you must pay 500 life points or this card is destroyed. But luckily, you probably won't be summoning this card out to field too often. It does have the sort of negation if your opponent rolls, or if you roll a 3 on your die, so that's kind of nice. But the main reason why you use this card is when Terra King Archfiend you control is destroyed and sent to the graveyard. Even during the damage step, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard, then target that Terra King Archfiend in your graveyard and special summon it. So this is very, very good at protecting your Terra King Archfiend. And Terra King Archfiend, as I mentioned earlier, is sort of the centerpiece of the deck and a very, very good card to keep around. So I think that this card is pretty decent. It can also combo with some other cards in some interesting ways, which I'll bring up when I cover some of the traps. But this is kind of neat to have. And at a worst case scenario, it can just serve as a blocker with 1800 defense. The last Archfiend monster here is Skull Archfiend of Lightning, which is kind of just an upgrade to Summon Skull. Although, playing Summon Skull just so it doesn't have the maintenance cost is also pretty decent. This is a 2500 attack point monster with 1200 defense, level 6, so you do have to tribute for it. And once per turn during your standby phase, you must pay 500 life points. When resolving an opponent's card effect that targets this card, roll 6-sided die and negate that effect if you roll a 1, 3, or 6. So, that's half the field for the options of the dice. And so that's pretty decent. Half the time you're going to get protection on this thing to targeted effects. Although, is that worth playing in a deck that's, already got targeted protection for a lot of its cards? And also, it's just kind of got to get as aggressive as possible and maybe can't take the time to sack one of its monsters off for a tribute monster. It's debatable whether this is actually good or not, but there are ways to cheat it out potentially. Now, one way to get around the sort of life point cost of all these cards is the field spell Pandemonium. It says neither player has to pay life points during the standby phase for Archfiend monsters. When an Archfiend monster is destroyed and sent to the graveyard except by battle, its owner can add one Archfiend monster from their deck to their hand with a lower level than the destroyed card. So, if you're playing something like Skull Archfiend of Lightning, that then lets you search pretty much any other Archfiend from your deck to your hand. But if you're, playing the level 4s, you can then search out either Deathstroke or Dark Bishop. You can also search out Vilepon. And that's arguably why Vilepon is very important because, it's searchable off the level 3s. But realistically, I think that Vilepon isn't really necessary here because mainly you just search out Deathstroke to then preserve your Terra Kings. Because that's all you really need Deathstroke for. You're never really committing Deathstroke to field. And this will never really, trigger Pandemonium. But, it is good to keep in mind. And if you do want to go all in on these, and even play Dark Bishop and stuff, then you might want to play the Vilepon just to get full value off Pandemonium. But Pandemonium, you want to stick around on field, and because of that, there is actually a monster to pair with it in the form of Pandemonium Watchbearer. A level 4 monster with 1300 attack, 1800 defense. So as long as this card remains face up on your side of the field, Pandemonium on your side of the field is not destroyed by your opponent's card effects. So, if you've got Pandemonium on field and you want to stick around, having an 1800 defense point monster is a decent way to do that, although there is a lot of removal in this format, so maybe not the best thing in the world, but it is something that can help. But moving on to some of the other reasons why you might want to play Archfiend besides their, sort of conditional effect negation and their monster negation in the form of Terra King, they actually do have an in-archetype Snatch Steal, which is actually pretty crazy. It's Falling Down. This is an equip spell. It says activate this card by targeting opponent's monster, equip this card to it, take control of it, and destroy this card unless you control an Archfiend card. During each of your opponent's standby phases, you take 800 damage. So, unfortunately, this is not negatable by Pandemonium, which is unfortunate. But if you've got an in-archetype Snatch Steal and you're taking your opponent's monsters and using them either like to tribute off for Skull Archfiend of Lightning or just to get in for additional damage, that cost might not matter too much. Now, I mentioned Terra King is sort of the centerpiece of the strategy, and there actually is a card centered around it in the form of Checkmate. Plays into the chess theme of the monsters. It also says tribute one Archfiend monster, then target one Terra King Archfiend you control. It can attack directly this turn. Is that worth it? Probably not, but it is a very interesting card, and it's very flavorful, so that's kind of fun as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that Deathstroke Archfiend can combo with some of the other cards in the archetype, and Archfiend's Roar is the main one that you do that with. It says pay 500 life points, then target one Archfiend monster in your graveyard, special summon that target, but it cannot be tributed. Also, it's destroyed during the end phase of this turn. So, if you use Archfiend's Roar to special summon out the Terra King Archfiend, which will get around to summoning condition, and then you attack with it, do whatever you want with it, and then it's destroyed during the end phase because of Archfiend's Roar, you can then use Deathstroke Archfiend to bring it back. So that's sort of a neat combo with this, and you could argue whether it's worth it or not because you're sort of spending 2 cards to bring out just a Terra King. But I think it's kind of neat, and it can come up in certain situations. So it's good to know about at least. You can also use Deathstroke to pair with Battle Scarred as well if the worst case scenario happens with this card. There's a continuous trap that says activate this card by targeting one Archfiend monster you control. Your opponent also pays the same life points that you pay for that monster during the standby phase, and when this card leaves the field, destroy that monster. If that monster leaves the field, destroy this card. Now, I don't really think that this card is a really good card. I think it conflicts with the main game plan of the strategy, because you're actively trying to mitigate the effect damage that you take through things like Pandemonium. And I feel like, having a card that actively conflicts with Pandemonium is not necessarily the best. So I don't really think that I'd play Battlescar in my builds of the deck. But it is a very interesting card to play here if you want to go for a different build. If you're getting really aggressive with your opponent, then it actually can come up. So it's not terrible, I guess. But I don't really think it's the best. But, as I said, if you're playing this card with Terror King and then you get Battlescar destroyed, and it destroys Terror King, you can then use Deathstroke to bring it back. So, I mean, that's kind of nice, but I don't really think that's worth it. You're losing too many cards, and yeah, it's kind of rough. But anyways, two other cards that I want to mention before leaving this section are the first being Life Absorbing Machine. This is a continuous trap that says during your standby phase, gain life points equal to half of the total life points you paid during your last turn. This can be pretty good at sort of recovering the damage that you're taking from all these Archfiend monsters. It's not 100% of a solution. I mean, if you have two of them on field, then it will be, I guess. But you are still taking damage. But I think that it does mitigate the cost enough for you to potentially win just by getting aggressive with all your other monsters here. The other card I want to mention is Megamorph. You probably are going to be lower than your opponent a lot of the time, given that you're paying a lot of life points. So Megamorph can come up as just a good equip spell to equip to one of your monsters to make it even bigger and then get in for damage. And then you constantly sort of drop lower than your opponent afterwards because you're paying life points every standby phase, or every one of your standby phases at least. So this card could come up. I think it's kind of awkward in the deck because you are trying to get aggressive, but it can go for some late game pushes that can kill your opponent out of nowhere. But that's going to do it for my coverage of the Archfiend sort of archetype here. I wanted to bring this up now because I think it's interesting to see all these Fiend monsters in one archetype, and it sort of plays interestingly with some of the other Fiend support that came out in this set, because this set did release some general Fiend support, along with some sort of support for other types as well. So let's dive into the general type support released in Dark Crisis now. So I know I mentioned Fiends, but I feel like it would be wrong to start this section by not talking about the zombie support the Dark Crisis introduced. And honestly, it isn't much, unfortunately. Vampire Lord, of course, came out, and that is pretty decent in zombie decks. You can fetch it out off of Pyramid Turtle, which is nice. And, as I mentioned before, it does dodge certain types of removal, which is pretty cool, too. But the other zombies are not really the same way. You've got Despair from the Dark, which is a zombie monster with 2800 attack, 3000 defense. It says, if this card is sent from your hand or deck to the graveyard by an opponent's card effect, special summon this card. So it's good counterplay to Vampire, I guess. Or I guess what you could do is you could creature swap your Vampire Lord with an opponent's monster, attack into the Vampire Lord, and then, they would have to call monsters. So that really isn't a good combo, but Despair from the Dark can come up in certain situations. If your opponent plays Delinquent Duo or something like that, then it can come up, I guess. But yeah, it's kind of a tough card to utilize fully. But it is an interesting card, definitely. And it's definitely a reason why, if you're playing Vampire Lord, maybe don't just blind call monster, unless you know that your opponent probably isn't playing Despair from the Dark. Fear from the Dark is very similar to Despair from the Dark, except it's a lot less powerful, only 1700 attack, 1500 defense, and at the same effect as Despair from the Dark, except, it's a lot less good because it doesn't have 2800 attack. So that's what the zombies deck got. I don't really think that it's that comprehensive of a support package, but it's something at least. And so I could definitely see a resurgence in people trying to play the zombie deck in this format. But moving on to the other types, before we dive into Fiends, I also want to mention Dragons. Dragons, Fiends, and Warriors were sort of the three first major type sort of support waves back in Legacy of Darkness. And so I feel like it's good to talk about all three of them together. Dragons received two new tribute monsters, Kaiser Glider and Different Dimension Dragon. Now, Kaiser Glider is interesting. It can't be destroyed by battle with a monster that has the same attack, so namely Jinzo is likely what you're running into most with this. And says, if this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, target one monster on the field, return that target to the hand, which can come up in certain situations and can be pretty decent. So that's a decent tribute monster for dragons now. We also get different Dimension Dragon, which is a level 5 monster, which has 1200 attack, 1500 defense. It says this card cannot be destroyed by spell trap effects that do not target it, and this card cannot be destroyed by battle with a monster that has 1900 less attack. Now, the interesting thing about this is it forms like a pseudo lock, because you can also shut off trap cards that do target it with something like Dragon's Bead, which is a continuous trap that negates trap effects that target face-up dragon monster you control, just at the cost of discarding a card from hand to grave. So that's kind of neat that it pairs with that, but I think ultimately this isn't the best. I mean, you can bring out Shining Angel, which is pretty good, but a lot of dragon decks would be playing stuff like Flying Kamakiri number 2, I think, number one, because that pairs better with a lot of the monsters that you bring out, like Spirit Ryu, and like Troop Dragon, Grey Wing, etc. So I feel like this is kind of out of place in the standard dragon deck, but it is pretty decent, and it is kind of funny if you do Shining Angel into this and then play Wingbeat of Giant Dragon to return to hand and then destroy a spell and traps on field. That's kind of a cool combo, not gonna lie. But yeah, I don't think that Different Dimension Dragon or Kaiser Glider are really that good for the dragon deck overall. Although they do both, sort of pair with Super Rejuvenation, just like any dragon tribute monster does. But now that I've covered the dragons, let's talk about the fiends, because fiends received a variety of interesting support beyond just the Archfiend monsters. First being Mephis the Infernal General. And this is sort of like a counterpart to Air Knight Powershoth. It's a level 5 monster with 1800 attacks, 1500 defense. So if this attacks an opponent's defense position monster, inflicts piercing battle damage. And if this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, make your opponent discard one random card. So whereas Air Knight draws you a card, Mephis discards a card. Now, I generally prefer drawing effects to discarding effects, so I still think Air Knight is a bit better, but it is an interesting card to play in this sort of deck, and, it is a Fiend, so that goes with other Fiends here. Fiends receive some more tribute monsters in the form of Great Maju Garzette and Maju Garzette. Great Maju Garzette is a level 6 monster that says the attack of this card becomes twice the original attack of one monster that you tributed for the tribute summon of this card. And Maju Garzette has a similar effect, so the attack of this card becomes equal to the combined original attack of the two monsters you tributed for the tribute summon of this card. Now, if you're noticing the math on this, this does actually make Great Maju Garzette just like better than Maju Garzette in pretty much every situation. Because if you got two monsters with different attacks, then you could potentially just choose to tribute the higher attack monster for Great Maju Garzette, and that would have more attack than tributing both for Maju Garzette. So I don't really think there's really a reason to play Maju Garzette at any point, whereas Great Maju Garzette, it's just strictly better. But realistically, I don't really think that either of these cards are that good in general. So, I don't really think it matters that much. But moving on to the last Fiend that came out in the set, I don't necessarily think this is like specific to the Fiend strategy, but it is kind of interesting. It's Goblin of Greed. It's a Fiend with 1000 attack, 1800 defense. This says as long as this card remains face up on your side of the field, neither player can activate effect by discarding a card from his or her hand. Now, this is kind of a confusing card in general. But basically it means that, like, if an opponent would use something like Raigeki Break with tributes for cost, they're not able to use it. They can still discard for things like Graceful Charity or Card Destruction, because those actually, have discarding as part of the effect. So it's kind of weird the way it's worded, but I mean, that's just how it works based on the rulings that I've seen. Let me know if I'm correct on that down in the comments below. So this can be a unique floodgate for certain types of decks, but I think overall it's just not really that good. And it doesn't synergize with the Fiend strategy at all. I mean, technically the Fiend, like, none of these cards like super synergize with it well. I guess Maju Garzette, if you're tributing two monsters, you get more Fuel in the Grave for Necrofear. But yeah, I don't really think the Fiends as an archetype are as coherent as like some of the other archetypal strategies are. So it's interesting noting these Fiend monsters that you can add to the deck, but I think ultimately it doesn't really change much. For the Warriors, they're kind of more consistent just because you have Reinforcement of the Army to use. And Warriors did get some pretty good cards here. DD War Lady being the main one. This card is insane. It's at 3 copies, so you might as well play all 3. We've also got Little Wingard, which is not really that good, but it can be sort of like an attacker that you then switch to defense and use defensively. It says once per turn during your end phase, you can change the battle position of this card. So what you can do is bring this out, attack it for 14, switch it to 18. so it's not bad, but it's not really that good either. Lively Loyal Goblin is an 1800 attack point monster that says, as long as this card remains face up on the field, control of this card cannot switch. So similar to Breaker in that way, because Breaker can't be Snatch Shield, this card can't be Snatch Shield either. But this card also can't be Change Hearted, so that's kind of nice, and could potentially be an option if you're afraid of that sort of thing. We've also got Sasuke Samurai number 2 as the last new warrior introduced, outside of a specific archetype, which we'll get to soon. And this card is probably the worst of the warriors in this set. It says once per turn during your main phase, you can pay 800 life points. If you do this, until the end phase, spell and trap card cannot be activated. So basically, you're bringing this card out and potentially going for like a big OTK push by stopping your opponent's things like Mirror Force or something like that. But realistically, like, this won't really affect things too much, and this card only has 200 attack, so it's kind of just like very much a win more card in my opinion. And you know, if you're not in a good position, this card is going to be absolutely terrible. But I guess with Reinforcing the Army, you can choose when to search it out. It's just, you never want to top deck this card, pretty much. I will also mention here, you know, some of the previous warriors that, you know, should see play in this deck. Zamire the Dark sees play, because it can get over things like Gravekeeper's Spy or just, you know, any beefy monster, and it sticks around on field for a bit, so it's good to search out with Reinforcing the Army. Exiled Force can also be used as removal, and Dawn's Salute can be used as hand destruction, which is pretty nice. Now, I also want to mention a sort of new type that actually got some support in this set, and that is fairies. The main fairy that's sort of tying it all together is Mudora. This is a 1500 attack point fairy that says this card gains 200 attack for each fairy monster in your graveyard. And this could be something like, you know, Shining Angels from previous sets where, you know, you can pretty easily like crash a bunch of Shining Angels into an opponent's monster and get 3 monsters in grave right away for Mudora to be at 2100 attack. But it also pairs well with a bunch of new fairies in the set, namely Kelbeck, Keldo, Agito, and Zolga. Now, I'm sure that, you know, if you're a modern player, you might have, you know, gotten some shivers at seeing some of these cards, just the war flashbacks triggering from tier format. But these are the original copies. These are not the retrains, so they're a lot less powerful. Kelbeck says if this card is attacked by a monster, after damage calculation, return that monster to hand. Keldo says if this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, target 2 cards in your opponent's graveyard, shuffle them into the deck. Agito says when this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard as a result of battle, roll a 6-sided die. You can special summon 1 fairy type monster from your graveyard whose level is equal to the number rolled. If the result is 6, you can special summon a level 6 or higher monster. And lastly, Zolga says if a monster attributed using this card, gain 2,000 life points. Now that can pair with like Air Knight Parshath. I don't think it pairs with Hysteric Fairy because it's only lets tribute summon, not tributed with an effect. But it's still, you know, those are 2 other fairies that you might want to include in the deck. And the last fairy that I'd say is probably worth a lot of consideration is Asura Priest, which can be very good against certain types of decks. Now, there is also Sensitive Dagla, which is a new equip spell. So equip only to a fairy monster, it gains 500 attack, and if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, gain life points equal to the damage inflicted, which is a pretty decent effect. So if you equip like a Sensitive Dagla to like a Mudora, and Mudora's already pumped up, this can gain you a lot of life, which can make it difficult for your opponent to actually win. And also, you know, fun fact, if your opponent takes whatever monster you have, equip with Sensitive Dagla, you will gain the... Or actually, I don't think you'd gain anything because it's just to your opponent. So never mind, that combo doesn't quite work. But it's good to acknowledge that it doesn't quite work here. Because it's only like to your opponent, the control of Sensitive Dagla. And if they're attacking you, that's not to your opponent, that's to you. So, but you know, good thing to know about there. Since I'm on the topic of fairies, and a lot of fairies are light, I also want to mention Ray of Hope, which can be used in the deck. It lets you add 2 light monsters from your graveyard to the deck and shuffle it. So, you know, if you've gone through all your, like, Shining Angels, then this allows you to get more, potentially. Although it does conflict with Mudora, because Mudora does gain attack for each fairy monster in your graveyard. So, maybe not the best card, maybe more use in certain other strategies, like maybe decks using a bunch of Magicians of Faith would want to get those Magicians of Faith back. But I think it's an interesting card to note here, at least. But that's going to do it for the new sort of generic type support released in this set. A lot of it isn't like the best. I think the main notable cards here are things like DD Warrior Lady or Vampire Lord. but a lot of it won't change too much. Now, I will say I excluded talking about a large number of warrior monsters released in this set because they're actually part of their own archetype. So let's dive into that archetype now. So in previous sets, we had seen like inklings of this strategy together. Don Zalug came first, and then you had Cliff the Trap Remover and Dark Scorpion Burglars. But now the gang is all here, all the Dark Scorpion gang together at last in a pretty terrible archetype. Now, I will say there are some cards that you can use here just in a generic warrior deck that can be pretty good. Like Don Zalug has already seen play in a lot of warrior decks in the past. And Clip the Trap Removal is a good spell and trap remover, especially if your opponent's playing things like Gravity Bind. This can get in there with level 3 and get rid of that. So, you know, some of the Dark Scorpions can see play, but together as an archetype, they are pretty bad. Now, let's start with the best new Dark Scorpion that's introduced, and that's Dark Scorpion Mane of the Thorn. When this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can activate one of these effects. Add one Dark Scorpion card from your deck to your hand, or target one Dark Scorpion card in your graveyard, add that target to your hand. Now, this card can actually be used as the centerpiece of sort of like a resource engine, where basically, you know, you're sort of using it to recycle itself, or just, you know, if you're playing something like Cliff the Trap Remover, you're using it to get that. And that can be pretty decent. Like, that has seen experimentation and things like GOAT. And so I don't think that's a terrible strategy. And if you are building like a Dark Scorpion deck, you're probably going to want to use it for that purpose. Because once you go past Mane, they get pretty bad. But, you know, I think that could be an interesting deck to experiment with. And so that might be something that I try later on in this format. The next Dark Scorpion, though, is pretty bad in the TCG, and that is Dark Scorpion Chick the Yellow. It's 1,000 attack, 1,000 defense. That says when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can activate one of these effects. Target one card in the field, return that target to the hand, or look at the top card of their deck and place it on the top or bottom of the deck. That second effect can be like decent, I guess. The first effect can also potentially be decent, but overall, this card is pretty bad. Like, there are very few cases where it would actually be useful. Of course, there is a combo that comes later in the game's history, namely in the OCG, not in the TCG, where this card is the centerpiece of like an OTK or like a very degenerate combo, but we never really got to experiment in that in the TCG, so this card is just like pretty bad overall. Lastly, we've got Dark Scorpion Gorg the Strong, which is easily the worst of the Dark Scorpions. It's a level 5 monster with 1800 attack. It says when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can activate one of these effects. Target one monster your opponent controls, return that target to the top of the deck, or send the top card of their deck to the graveyard. So in a best case scenario, this can sort of draw lock your opponent, because you're giving them back a monster that's kind of useless. But honestly, that will only draw lock them for like one turn, and 1800 attack is not really worth the tribute. And yeah, so this card is really bad, I think. Like, easily the worst of the Dark Scorpions. Now, I will say there is a pretty cheeky way to get Gorg on field without tributing, and that is a Mustering of the Dark Scorpions. This is a spell card that says, if you control a face-up Don Zalug, you can special summon any number of Dark Scorpion monsters from your hand, but only one copy of each, because it would be too broken if you could summon more than one copy of each. I mean, I think that's more there for lore reasons, because, like, it's cool to get all 5 different Dark Scorpions on field, to, you know, sort of use their effects in battle. But realistically, this card is really bad. If you ever manage to pull it off and get out a field of 5 Dark Scorpions, that's really good. Because then you can potentially use the trap card Dark Scorpion combination, which says you can only activate this card when there are Don Zalug, Cliff the Trap Remover, Dark Scorpion Chick the Yellow, Dark Scorpion Gorg the Strong, and Dark Scorpion Mane of the Thorn face up on your side of the field. During this turn, any of these 5 cards can attack your opponent's life points directly. In that case, the battle damage inflicted to your opponent by each of these cards becomes 400 points. Now, I think that last line is just really unfortunate, right? Well, I think if anyone managed to pull off Dark Scorpion combination, they deserve to get the full amount of damage in, because, like, I mean, the amount of hoops you have to jump through to actually pull off that combo are so insane. And it doesn't even kill you if you're at 8,000 life points. Altogether, I think it's 6,400 total. And, like, I mean, honestly, the Dark Scorpion player deserves it if they can pull off the Dark Scorpion combination. So, you know, it's very unfortunate. It's just making a already bad deck, like, even worse. And, yeah, I don't think that this is really good to go all in on like Dark Scorpion combination and Mustering of the Dark Scorpions. I honestly don't even think it's worth like playing things like Gorg the Strong or Chick the Yellow. I think the 3 Dark Scorpion monsters you can probably justify the most are Mane of the Thorn, Don Zalug, and Cliff the Trap Removal. in just various different ways. But I think as a cohesive archetype, doesn't really work out quite as well. Now, I will say there are some things you can do with this archetype. Other support tools for consistency, reinforcing the army. Any warrior deck wants to play this. Very, very good. Also, if you just want to get in the damage to trigger their effects, you got things like Shooting Starbow Seal for monsters that have over 1,000 attack. This can allow them to attack directly. They will be very weak, but, for instance, if you're ripping a card out of hand, you might not necessarily care. You've also got Secret Paths for the treasures. This is for the monster with 1,000 or less attack, which, this will let them attack directly for at least one turn. So, those can be used in conjunction with this strategy, but honestly, I think going all in with the strategy in this way is just really, really bad. And you just want to use the Dark Scorpions sort of individually for their main purposes, like Midnight Thorn as a resource engine or Don Toluga as a discarder. But it will be interesting to see what things like the main A resource engine actually do and whether that's actually worth playing in this format or not. But I'm excited to experiment with it. But now that I've covered this sort of new archetype, let's cover one of the other major strategies that got some support in this format, and that is ritual monsters. Dark Crisis released 3 new ritual monsters, and 2 of them aren't even that bad, The first of them is Shinato, King of a Higher Plane. This is a 33 attack point monster, level 8 ritual monster. But when it destroys a defense position monster and sends it to the graveyard as a result of battle, you get to inflict damage to your opponent's life points equal to the original attack of the destroyed monster. So that's honestly pretty decent. This card can also slot into the fairy strategy, as Senju is also a fairy. So you could potentially, play them with Mudoras, get in additional damage on top of it. So I think this card is not bad. 3,300 attack and nothing to scoff at either. I don't know. It's a ritual monster. It comes with the flaws that regular ritual monsters do. You need to have a way to search out the ritual spell, Shinato's Arc, and the monster. But decks do have Senju and Sonic Bird to search those out. And you do have to pay a decent cost to actually bring this card out onto the field. 8 stars total. But if you're able to get it stick and use its effect, then that can be pretty decent. Dark Master Zork is another level 8 ritual monster, but it's dark and a fiend, so you could potentially use it in fiend decks as well, although you don't necessarily need to do that. And it says you can ritual to summon this card with Contract with the Dark Master, which is a specific ritual spell card. And once per turn, you can roll a 6-sided die, then destroy all monsters your opponent controls if you roll a 1 or 2. Destroy 1 monster your opponent controls if you roll 3, 4, or 5, and destroy all monsters you control if you roll a 6. Now, obviously, rolling a 6 is pretty bad, and, we will cover that there's a contingency for rolling the 6 if you do want to play it, but I saved that for its own section. But the first, 5 rolls there, those are pretty good effects, and 2,700 attack is, again, nothing to scoff at. Now, I mentioned that, you use Contract with the Dark Master as its ritual-specific effect, because it actually has another ritual spell in this format that can be used for it, and that is Contract with the Abyss. This is a ritual spell that can be used to ritual summon any dark ritual monster. You must also tribute monster from your hand or field whose total levels exactly equal the ritual monster's level that you want to ritual summon. Now, realistically, if you're playing a Zork deck, you probably are just fine with Dark Master. Dark Master can come up in more situations because occasionally you'll have situations where you don't have the exact number of stars, but you have slightly over, but you still want to bring out Zork. So Contract with the Dark Master is a bit more flexible in that way. But if you do want to play another dark ritual monster like Relinquished, which is one of the most powerful ritual monsters from previous format, then you can potentially do that. Since Serpent is a very powerful card that can pair with this as well. So I could definitely see a ritual deck playing like Contract with the Abyss instead, just to have the flexibility to go into either Zork or Relinquished. And both of their levels are not the worst to get. Most monsters that you play are level 4, and so it'll just take 2 level 4s either way to bring out Zork. And if you are playing this Serpent, as I mentioned, then Relinquish can be brought out off of that. So you might want to just play Contract with the Abyss instead. And that would be kind of interesting to see if anyone makes that sort of combined ritual strategy there. Last ritual monster I want to mention goes with a strategy from the previous format, which is spell counters, and that is the legendary Flame Lord. This is a level 7 ritual monster that's brought out off of Incandescent Ordeal. And it says that each time you or your opponent activates 1 spell card, put 1 spell counter on this card. Remove 3 spell counters from this card to destroy all monsters on the field except this card. Now, that is a pretty decent effect. Just wiping the field clean, being able to attack in for 2,400 after that. But it does require a bunch of hoops to jump through. You have to pay a lot of cards to actually bring it out. because you're probably going to have to spend 2 monsters at least to bring it out off of Incandescent Ordeal. And then you also have to basically spend 3 more spells to actually buff this thing up to 3 counters, and then you finally get the board wipe. But that's effectively like 5 cards, 6 cards to actually get that effect off. And that's just a level of investment that you can't really pull off in this format. Yes, you are probably getting some additional benefits from these spells that you're activating, but overall, this card is just too many hoops to jump through and not enough payoff to actually make it worthwhile, even though the payoff is pretty powerful here. And that's going to do it for the new ritual monsters I wanted to talk about here. Now, I did mention that, there was an additional thing to talk about with Zork, with that extra contingency when you roll a 6. But that relates to a section of the video that I'm going to be calling the anime strats. Now, of course, I can't start off the section called anime strats without talking about the cover card for this set, Exodia Necros. Now, Exodia Necros is a very, very interesting way to play Exodia. It can't be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned with the spell card Contract with Exodia. Now, Contract with Exodia is a normal spell that says if you have all 5 of Exodia the Forbidden One, right arm of the Forbidden One, left arm of the Forbidden One, right leg of the Forbidden One, and left leg of the Forbidden One in your graveyard, you get to special summon 1 Exodia Necros from your hand. So, this is kind of a stringent summoning condition, but there are ways to pull it off. Painful choice to send all the Exodia pieces can be pretty good, and then you just have 1 left in hand. There are many, many ways to get that in the graveyard. So, it's not as hard to pull off as you might think, although you do have to hard open Painful Choice to make it really consistent. But if you do that, you get a pretty decent payoff with Exodia Necros, as this card cannot be destroyed by battle or spell trap effects, and once per turn during your standby phase, this card gains 500 attack. Of course, it's destroyed unless all 5 pieces of Exodia are in your graveyard, but a lot of people aren't really running Kaiku anymore, and things like Soul Release and stuff like that are side deck techs at best, and most people aren't even playing them in the side deck. Now, of course, this card does fall victim to, one of the most popular outs in this format, which is DD Warrior Lady, as that can banish it, and that won't destroy it, so that will be able to clear this card from the field after you spent all that investment bringing it out. And also Magical Scientist can clear it as well, because you can bring out Thousand Eyes Restrict, suck up the Exodia Necros, and at the end of the turn when Restrict returns back to the deck, it will be destroyed just through game mechanics. So, I don't really think this is the, best boss monster in the world, because it takes a lot of effort to bring out, and also it's just too easily cleared. But if you are able to stick it on field and have it around for a couple turns to just keep gaining attack, that can be very, very threatening for your opponent to deal with. So, very, very cool anime strat here. Next up, we've got Mirage Knight, which is something that you can bring out off of Dark Flare Knight. And Mirage Knight is abjectly terrible, really, really bad. Basically, this card, it can't be normal summoner set, it must be special summoned by Dark Flare Knight, and the way that happens is when Dark Flare Knight's destroyed by battle, you get to special summon the Mirage Knight from hand or deck. And what Mirage Knight says is that during damage calculation only, this card gains attack equal to the original attack of the opponent's monster is battling, and then during the end phase of a turn this card attacked or was attacked, banish this card. Now, that basically guaranteed 2,800 damage, which is, not terrible, but for all the hoops you have to jump through to actually bring this thing out, that is a lot. Now, of course, you can bring out Dark Flare Knight off of Magical Scientists, so it's not the worst thing to fulfill that condition, but your opponent does have to have a monster with over 2,200 attack to make that worthwhile, and it's just, you got to play this brick of a card, Mirage Knight, in your deck, and it doesn't really do anything outside of that. I mean, luckily, if you draw it, it's not the end of the world, because Dark Flare Knight can summon from hand as well, but it's still a brick, and, why play this card when, if you're faced with an opponent's monster with over 2,200 attack, and you've got Scientists on field, there are other ways to out that. You can just bring out Restrict and suck it up. I don't know. It just seems like such a weird strat, and a really bad strat that is just way too conditional, and not really worth it in the end. But last strat I want to talk about here is Berserk Dragon, which I believe was an anime strat. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe this is a misnomer then. But Berserk Dragon is really, really cool. It can only be brought out with a deal with Dark Ruler, and a deal with the Dark Ruler says, if a level 8 or higher monster under your control was sent to the graveyard this turn, special summon 1 Berserk Dragon from your hand or deck. And this is the condition that I was talking about for Zork, because Zork is level 8. So if you are playing Zork and you do roll that 6, you can always play a deal with Dark Ruler to bring out Berserk Dragon as a follow-up. And Berserk Dragon is really, really good. It's got 3,500 attack. It says this card can attack all monsters your opponent controls once each. During each of your end phases, this card loses 500 attack. That could be a bad condition if it lasts that long. But realistically, if this card's attacking all monsters your opponent controls every turn, and you're also getting in for other damage, like, that's going to be fine. And this card doesn't really get bad until it drops like to 2,000. And even 2,000 isn't that bad to have. So I think this card is pretty good if you're actually able to stick it on field. The unfortunate thing is playing a deal with Dark Ruler. There just aren't really many level 8 or higher monsters that you want to be playing. I'd say outside of Zork, like the two that would probably see play in decks like in general would probably be Despair from the Dark, which might see play in a zombie deck, or Lava Golem, which might see play in a burn deck. But each of those is kind of an awkward fit for Berserk Dragon. I guess Berserk Dragon is a zombie, so you can play it more with Despair from the Dark, but can't be brought back with something like Book of Life. So, you know, the zombie typing doesn't really help it that much. I guess you can play like Teuton Mask with it to protect it, but I think it's still kind of, you know, just bad. Now, there are some other, if we're talking about anime strats, there are some other level 8 anime monsters that you might want to bring out. Like Blue Eyes White Dragon can pair very well with Berserk Dragon. And 3,000 attack is nothing to scoff at as well. So, you know, if your opponent clears the Blue Eyes, you just bring out Berserk, and you still got a big beater. Valkyria on the Magna Warrior is very funny with deal from Dark Ruler, because you can actually trigger this card's effect to tribute it, and that's supposed to summon out all the other Magnet Warriors, and then you can bring out Berserk Dragon to clear your opponent's field, then attack in with the Magnet Warriors for a ton of damage. So that's kind of cool. Neat combo. It does take a lot to actually go right there, but it is kind of cool if you're able to pull it off. Moisture Creature is another way you can potentially, you know, set up there. You can tribute 3 monsters, clear your opponent's back row, and then, you know, if this card goes away somehow, you can deal with Dark Ruler to bring out Berserk Dragon without having to fear your opponent's back row. Necrofear is another level 8 that you can use. That's probably easier to bring out than some of the others, but it's kind of anti-synergistic with Berserk Dragon, because Berserk Dragon is going to be attacking your opponent's monsters anyways, so they won't have a monster to then take over with Dark Necrofear afterwards. And the last level 8 or higher monster that I want to mention here is Koitsu. You can equip this to one of your monsters, Aitsu, and then if it's sent to the graveyard as a spell or trap, you can then still deal with Dark Ruler. Now, why did I go through all of the individual level 8 or higher monsters you can sort of play with this? Is because there really are not many that can pair with the deal with Dark Ruler right now. Of course, I didn't mention like Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth or Gate Guardian or stuff like that. But you know, that's digging like into the bottom of the barrel. Like, these are already some of the dregs that you can get for a deal with Dark Ruler, and those are just like sort of the impossible conditions for it. So I think this combo is a bit rough, and there aren't really many ways to play it except like Zork probably being your best. But it is still kind of cool, and definitely neat to see as sort of an anime strat. And if you are playing the level 8s to bring out Berserk Dragon with a deal with Dark Ruler, there are some cards that do go with it. Things like Precious Cards from Beyond. When you tribute summon a monster using 2 or more tributes, you draw 2 cards. And Alter for Tribute can also trigger deal with Dark Ruler while giving you a ton of life points, as this lets you select a monster on your side of the field and send it to the graveyard, increase your life points by an amount equal to the original attack of the monster. That can be pretty good in the case of something like Blue Eyes White Dragon. Now, you might be seeing this and wondering, like, well, what about things like Metamorphosis? Surely it's good to get out like a big fusion monster with that, and then also additionally get out Berserk Dragon. Well, the unfortunate thing is that there aren't any fusion monsters released at this time that are level 8. Which is very strange to say. You'd think there would be one. And I guess technically, I think Dark Paladin and XYZ Dragon Cannon are, but these cards can't be special summoned with Metamorphosis, so you can't actually bring them out that way. Blacktail Dragon is level 9, so the only thing you can do that with is Moisture Creature, really. But outside of that, you can't use meta to trigger deal, which is really weird and cuts off another avenue for triggering this card. But it's still kind of interesting to talk about there. So, now that I've covered the various sort of anime strats in this format, before diving into just the general other cards that Dark Crisis released, I want to talk about sort of like one card strategies that were just enabled by like one new release from Dark Crisis. Now, of course, I call these one card strats, but realistically, there's one new card that comes out in Dark Crisis that sort of enables a new style of play using other cards that obviously exist. So, I figure I'll talk about them all in their own section. Now, of course, I'm violating the rules of this section in the very first slot because I'm including final attack orders and skill drain, which can together form the backbone of sort of a skill drain beats deck. Because you can pair these with things like Goblin Attack Force and Giant Orc, just have these big beaters that don't really have a downside, because normally these cards, they can get over one monster, but then they switch to defense position. They've only got 0 defense, so they're very weak. Final attack orders prevents that from actually, being a problem, because this card will switch them back to attack position, and thus keep them around and still beating in. And then skill drain can also negate their effects and just prevent them from switching to defense in the first place. So this sort of strategy will become a lot more popular like later on in the game's history, as well as even more monsters that have these negative downsides come out, and skill drain can negate more of them. But I still think it's very, very cool that this strategy exists. Also, I will mention that final attack orders can be used with Dream Clown in a way. Not really too effectively, as you have to have a way to switch to defense in the first place. But if you do have an effect that can switch to defense, something like Ryu Kitchen Clown, it will then, switch right back to attack. And so you'll get the pop and also get to keep attacking in. But obviously that isn't the best, because you need that additional card like Ryu Kitchen Clown to do that. But I figured I'd just mention that here. Next up, I want to talk about non-spellcasting area. This is a continuous spell that says all face-up monsters except for effect monsters are unaffected by other spell effects. And this is kind of interesting because there are a lot of very powerful spells in this format. Because, no cards are forbidden yet. Things like Raigeki Dark Hole, Change of Heart, etc. Those are very, very good. And if your opponent actually manages to top deck them and clear your board, then that can be really, really bad for you. So, negating, or not necessarily even negating, but making a fair portion of your monsters unaffected by spells can be very, very strong. And so you could potentially just play this card in a deck playing a bunch of powerful normal monsters, things like Archfiends Soldier or Gemini Elf, or even Summon Skull. And just having these monsters on field, beating over your opponent's monsters, and your opponent can't really do anything about it with their powerful spells because you've got non-casting spell area up. Now, this does have some major flaws. This card dies to things like Mystical Space Typhoon, Heavy Storm, Harpy's Feather Duster, Break of the Magical Warrior. So there are a lot of ways to out this. But I think overall, it could still be a neat strategy that could be experimented with. And I'm curious to see what people would come up with for it. So I might be experimenting with it myself as well. And also, if you are playing things like Summon Skull, you can play things like Cost Down to bring this out on field very easily. And also, you can play other sort of spell cards in the deck that would affect all monsters on field normally, but then not affect them while non-spellcasting areas up. Things like Messenger of Peace will not prevent your monsters from attacking while non-spellcasting areas up, and things like Shield and Sword will not switch their attack and defense. So you can use this to sort of get over your opponent's monsters while your monsters stay beefy. But those are all sort of theories about the deck. I think, if the deck actually materializes, it probably won't be playing things like this. It'll probably just be using non-spellcasting area to actually, prevent its own cards from being destroyed or taking control over things like that. But still a very, very cool strategy that I hope people experiment with. And lastly, I want to talk about Tsukiyomi. Now, I mentioned this in the generically good cards section of the video, and I do think it's just good in a general good stuff deck, but you can enable a sort of flip control with this card itself. You could do it with like the GOAT control stuff with Thousand Head Restrict, although GOAT format players don't get too excited about that because the way that battle position change rules work in this format doesn't actually enable the Suk Thousand Head Restrict lock as much as it does in GOAT, because basically after a monster's battle position has been changed by an effect, you then can't manually change it later that turn. So if you do want to pull off the Thousand Eyes Restrict lock, what you'll have to do is basically suck up a monster with Thousand Eyes Restrict, switch it to defense, and then wait a turn, summon Tsukiyomi the next turn, flip down the Thousand Eyes Restrict that's in defense, then flip it face up into attack and suck up another monster. So it takes 2 turns. Realistically, it takes 3 turns. Because after you suck up another monster, you then have to wait another turn to switch to defense and so on. So it's not really the best. Like, it's not as good as it is in GOAT for sure, but it's something you can do. I think the more promising sort of Tsukiyomi loop that you can do is with Mask of Darkness and Time Seal. This is sort of build your own Yada lock, because what you do is you use Time Seal to prevent your opponent from drawing. Then you set a Mask of Darkness, and hopefully your opponent doesn't have a way to clear this. You flip the Mask of Darkness on your next turn to add back the Time Seal. Summon Tsukiyomi to flip it back down. Set the Time Seal. Use the Time Seal. They can't draw again. And then you can just repeat that process over and over to prevent them from drawing. So it does kind of restrict you in the form of like what you're able to summon, and if your opponent does have a way to disrupt this combo, then you're kind of in a tough spot. But if you're able to actually get the lock off, then you basically just win the game there. And I do think it's a very interesting sort of gameplay that I think people will experiment with, and it is something that I am curious about experimenting with as well. But now that I've covered the sort of more cohesive strategies in this format, let's talk about the remaining cards in Dark Crisis and, why they don't really fit in anywhere and whether they're actually any good. So if you've been watching my guides for a while, then you'll notice that this section is a lot smaller than it has been in the past. And, that doesn't necessarily mean that Dark Crisis had a ton of better cards in it than previous sets, because as we've gone through in this guide, it definitely did not. However, I will say that I think as Yu-Gi-Oh! Is going on, a lot of the cards are less just like random things that you can fit into like any sort of pile, and more just like devoted to specific strategies or enabling specific strategies. So I think that as time goes on, this section is going to get smaller and smaller until maybe eventually it even disappears entirely. But there are still some cards in this set that sort of just don't really fit in anywhere and aren't really good enough to go in the generically good section of the video. So this is the best place to talk about it, and let's start with Death's Feral Imp. Now this is a flip monster with 1600 attack, 1800 defense, which is not bad stats, honestly. That says flip, target one card in your graveyard, shuffle that target into your deck. Now this could potentially be used to like reuse a powerful spell or a powerful monster or something. But realistically, like having a powerful spell or monster in your graveyard is already pretty good, because that has multiple ways to access them, like Magician of Faith, Monster Reborn, etc. And shuffling back into your deck, it's a lot harder to get out unless you can search out with like Sanguine or Witch. So I think this card is not really the best in most situations, and it really depends on like the game state for when it would actually be good. It's either really bad or potentially okay. And a card like that you don't really want to fit into your deck. So I don't really think this card will see play anywhere. But maybe, there are some weird decks that would take advantage of it, and we'll just have to see. I mean, I guess maybe for Scientist of Decay, you want to put Scientist back in the deck, be searched out with Last Will. I could see that, but it's probably a bit too slow for Scientist of Decay. Next up, we've got Metallizing Parasite Lunatite, which is a level 7 monster with 1000 attack, 500 defense. It says once per turn during your main phase, if you control this monster on the field, you can equip it to a face-up monster on your side of the field as an equip card, or unequip the union equipment and special summon this card in face-up attack position. While equipped to a monster by this card's effect, that monster will be unaffected by the effect of spell cards controlled by your opponent. So, as I mentioned with non-spellcasting area, that's a very powerful effect, as, spell cards are some of the most powerful cards in the game. But this card takes too many hoops to jump through to actually make it worth it. You can bring it out off something like Mother Grizzly. And Mother Grizzly is not the worst card in this format, as, you can bring out Sinister Serpent with it as well to get that rotation. So I guess, it can have that application there. But, like, Mother Grizzly is already weak to, like, DD Warrior Lady, so you're less likely to bring that out. And if you ever hard draw this card, it's really, really weak, because it's level 7, so you'd have to tribute 2 monsters to actually make it worth it. But I guess this card could potentially see play in a water deck. The effect is very good. It's just you need to have a powerful enough monster to then not die from battle, or else it's all for naught. So I don't think this card is that good. I think it's way too specific, and there's not really a deck that can support it right now. Next up, we've got Thousand Needles, which is a level 4 beast monster. This says when this defense position card is attacked, and if the defense of this card is higher than the attack of the attacking monster, destroy the attacking monster at the end of the damage step. And 1800 defense is not that bad. There are some monsters that would attack into this and be destroyed. And you can also buff its defense with something like the Reliable Guardian. Now, that all being said, is this card better removal than any of the other cards in the set? Not really. There are much better removal options and much better monster options in general as well. So I don't really think this card is that good. Honestly, like Old Vindictive Magician would probably be better than this card, because that's a guaranteed pop. And also, I guess this card stays around on the field a little bit longer, but like, what are you really using it for there? I guess you can combine it with tribute monsters, but I don't know. I feel like there are better tribute enablers than this. So I'm not really the biggest fan of Thousand Needles, but I think it is a very cool card. And it's a card that I loved a lot as a kid. So, it's got a special place in my heart at least. But moving on to the spells, we've got Different Dimension Gate. There's a continuous spell that says activate this card by targeting one monster in each field, banish those targets. When this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, return those banished monsters to the field in the same battle position they were in. At this point in the game's history, this card isn't really that abusable. There aren't really many ways to get cards back from the banish zone, so there's nothing you can really do with shenanigans of like, oh, you banish your monster and your opponent's monster, and then you bring back your monster, right? So this is sort of just like temporary removal that you do have to sink your own monster into. So it's like a 2-for-1, but your opponent can always shut it off by like using Mystical Space Typhoon or other spell and trap removal. So I don't really think this is that good, but it could potentially see play in decks that really, really want removal and don't really care about losing their own monsters. Next up, we got Rot of the Mind's Eye. There's an equip spell that says, if a monster equip this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, the damage becomes 1,000 points. Now, that can be decent in certain scenarios. I can't really think of many scenarios where it'd be decent, but basically you can equip it to a weak monster. If that monster attacks directly, you get in for 1,000 damage. Equip it to a strong monster, but a monster that's attacking over a lot of your opponent's monsters, that would only normally deal like 100 or 200 damage because that's the attack difference is so minuscule, and that could bump up that attack difference. You can also equip this to an opponent's monster that's really strong, and then it only deals 1,000 damage to you each turn when it attacks in. But I think overall this card is way, way too niche. And there's not really a deck that would like be like, yeah, that's exactly what I need in this strategy. So I don't really think it's that good, but it's definitely an interesting card to talk about. Next up, we got Token Thanksgiving. There's a normal spell that says destroy all tokens on the field and increase your life points by the number of tokens destroyed by 800 points. Now, I think like there's not really a good way to abuse this. It could be a good counter card against like Scapegoat, but there are better cards against Scapegoat like King Tiger Wanghu or Asura Priest that actually do more. The life point gain is okay in certain situations, and maybe there's something you can do with like a Fire Princess strat where you've got a way to repeatedly spam tokens, and then you token Thanksgiving to gain life points. But you can only token Thanksgiving once, and then it's in the graveyard. You can recycle with something like Magician of Faith, but I don't really think that's that good. And yeah, I don't think this card is that good in general. But it's an interesting card, and maybe if there is a token deck in the future that is like very dominant, this card will see play because it can clear those tokens. But for now, it's not really that good. Next up, we've got Blast Held by a Tribute. Now, this is an iconic anime card, but in the TCG, it's not really that good. When an opponent's monster that was Tribute summoned declares an attack, destroy as many face-up attack position monster they control as possible, and if you do, inflict 1,000 damage to your opponent. Now, the issue with this is that one of the most common Tribute monsters in this format is Jinzo, and this card is shut off by Jinzo. Now, another common tribute monster that you might see in this format, although it has been sort of phased out more, is Vampire Lord. Vampire Lord comes back after being destroyed by this. And the only really tribute monster that this can really hit outside of like rogue options are things like Dark Ruler Hades. And if it hits Dark Ruler Hades, that's pretty good. But there are just other more generic removal options that will probably be a little bit better, even if this can occasionally serve as a mirror force. So I don't really think this card's that good, but it could potentially see siding in decks as like an anti-tribute tech. Next up, we've got Dice Reroll, which is honestly one of the most infuriating cards in the game's history. It's a normal trap that says one time during the rest of this turn, if either player rolls a dice or a dice, you can have the players re-roll. You can only gain this effect once per turn. So the reason why I find this infuriating is that you have to do it before the dice roll happens, which means that like you basically got to bet that your luck will be bad, and then your luck will be good after the reroll. Like, this is just a wasted card if you roll well. And if you're playing a gambling deck in general, you're probably going to gamble that you're going to roll well. Or at least that's the fun of the deck at least. So I don't really think this card's that good. I think it's actively terrible. I think it's one of the worst cards ever printed, in my opinion. I just don't like it. Also, what is going on with the art at the bottom of this? Like, what are these two like smoke clouds? Please let me know that in the comments, because that has perplexed me in making this guide. I stared at those for at least 5 minutes, wondering like what those were, because I have no idea what those are or what they're meant to be. But anyways, moving on to more traps, we've got Spell Vanishing. There's a counter trap that says discard 2 cards from your hand, negate the activation of a spell card and destroy it. Also look at your opponent's hand and deck, and if you find any spell cards of the same name as the destroyed spell card, send all of them to the graveyard. Now, this can be decent in certain situations. Things like MST are good to clear from your opponent's deck entirely. But most of the most powerful spells in this format are limited spells like Raigeki, Dark Hole, Change of Heart, etc. And your opponent's not going to have more of those in their deck. So I don't think Spell Vanishing is really that good in this format. Maybe in future formats where people are playing a lot of the same spells, it could be good. but the cost being 3 cards essentially to negate a spell and then, potentially hit others in the deck is just way too much. And so I don't really think this card is that good. Although very, very cool artwork with the Breaker the Magical Warrior there. Last card I want to talk about here is Staunch Defender. This is a normal trap that says you can only activate this card when your opponent declares an attack. Select one face-up monster on your side of the field. During this turn, your opponent can only designate the selected target, add an attack target, and your opponent must attack the selected monster with all face-up monsters. Now, this isn't terrible. I almost considered putting this in the generally good cards section of the video, but this is just so niche. And there's just so much better traps that you could use here instead. Like, the only way that this comes up is if you've got a monster on your side of the field with a lot of attack in face-up attack position, and your opponent's got a lot of weaker monsters, and yet they're still attacking into one of your other weaker monsters that's on their side of the field. Like, that's the only reason I could see this like being super good. Otherwise, it's just sort of a defensive option. Like, let's say you've got a monster in defense, and your opponent just has to attack all their monsters in that. Like, that's not the worst. But yeah, I think in general, this is probably like outclassed by like a Sakuretsu armor, right? That's realistically going to kill more monsters than this will. And so I don't really think this is worth really playing. And I think there are very, very few decks that could actually, sort of glean an advantage out of this that they wouldn't get from any of the various other traps in this format. So that's going to do it for all the new cards introduced by Vampire format. It was definitely a bit of a long one here. And I think it's very cool to see all these new cards, even if not all of them really do that much. Now, I will say that the sort of unlimited Dark Crisis format that comes before this, I don't think is really that different from the Vampire format that we're covering now, especially because the power level of all these cards is pretty weak. The main things here would just be like Vampire Lord going to 3 copies and Magical Scientist still being at 3 copies. So, like, the zombie deck could play with 3 Vampire Lord, I guess. But I don't think the zombie deck would be that good with Dark Crisis Unlimited format. And Scientist decks are a bit better in Dark Crisis Unlimited, I guess. But I think there realistically aren't too many changes. So I know that people have sort of sent me things saying like, the Unlimited Dark Crisis format is also sort of a format that was played at the time, and so I should cover that first. But I think Vampire is the more popular format, and there's not enough differences between them to really cover the Dark Crisis format in depth on its own. So I will be just going through the Vampire format coverage before covering that Unlimited format of Dark Crisis. But I will cover it eventually, so don't worry about that. But before ending this guide, I do want to talk about some topping deck lists that have been played in previous events in this format. So I know that some of you just recoiled in horror at seeing this deck pop up on screen, but this deck does show that Scientist FTK is still alive and kicking in Vampire format, despite Scientist being at 1 copy. This was the second place list piloted by Ellie Tin Can in the last Vampire format tournament, which I'll link coverage to that format tournament in the description down below. But this was held in 2021, so a little while ago. And there are only 14 people in the event, so maybe it's not the best sample size there either. But either way, I think the fact that this deck made it to second place is still pretty good and shows that, still a very, very good deck. And I think that maybe given the experimentation that's gone in Breaker, there are changes that you could make to this Scientist FTK deck that maybe would make it even more consistent or even better. So I'm not really going to talk about this deck like too much, because not really much has changed from Breaker format. Honestly, like looking at the main deck, I don't really see anything that's added from Dark Crisis, unless I'm just missing something obvious here. And the side deck, the only thing that's added is like this copy of DD Warrior Lady, like, and that's it. So I mean, Dark Flare Knight is in the extra, so that's an additional bit of damage a little bit, but not really enough to really make too big of a difference. So yeah, I think that this is just pretty much a standard Scientist FTK list. And, you can watch my coverage of Breaker format for that. But I'm not going to linger too long on this. I just want to show this as a good example of a deck that, is still alive and kicking. And if you want to play Scientist in Vampire, this is a pretty decent starting point. But now that I've covered this and sort of gotten it out of the way, let's talk about the topping list from that event and see what a more realistic expectation for like a tier 1 sort of good stuff deck looks like. Now, I called this deck sort of a good stuff list because it is playing like a lot of very good cards here, but realistically, it is more of a warrior deck, playing double reinforced from the army, playing a bunch of warriors as well, the DD Warrior Ladies, Vampire of the Dark, Exiled Force. This is more of a warrior list, and I think it shows the power that DD Warrior Lady does have in this format. Now, looking at all the topping lists from previous tournaments in this format, which, to be fair, there aren't too many, and there weren't too many people playing in each one. Vampire Lord was nowhere to be found, not even in the side deck. I think a big reason for that is DD Warrior Lady. Like, this card just is so punishing for that. And it's also just punishing for a lot of decks in general, just clearing monsters that are tough to get rid of, getting rid of Sangan, Serpent, Witch, all those cards is very, very tough. And when you have access to Warrior Lady through things like Reinforced with the Army, it's very, very good. You can also access like Exiled Forces of Fire in the Dark to deal with other threats. And, this deck is playing Gravekeeper's Spy, which, as I mentioned before, has been seeing experimentation in Yada, and is likely still very, very good in Vampire format as well. So other than that, this is like a pretty standard list. I will be testing out this list exactly on my channel in the coming days, because I feel like when entering a new format, it's always best to start with the sort of topping list from the last big event, just to sort of orient yourself and sort of see how it plays. But I'll be discussing this more there, but I think this is a really, really sick list and a very, very good starting point for sort of playing in this format if you are interested. And I think the decks like this are probably going to be the best decks in the format. Of course, there are things like Scientist FTK, which are running around, which can win games. But as we saw in the Breaker format tournament, where the deck was arguably more powerful, like, it isn't necessarily guaranteed that that is going to win an event. And, if you get an event big enough, that deck might not even make it into the top 2. So I'm very excited to sort of dive into this format. I will be hosting a tournament for it in December, so look out for that. I'll be making announcements for that in my Discord server, link in the description down below. If you want to play Vampire format or any of the other formats that I've covered on my channel, that is the best place to do it. But for now, this guide has gone on long enough. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, people who did watch all the way to the end. And I hope that this was very helpful if you are interested in playing this format for yourself. I'm really excited to dive into it. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.